It began in silence. Then came the sound of boots on broken glass, the echo of walls rising to cage an entire people. In the heart of Europe's proudest city, behind cold bricks and barbed wire, a world was buried alive. Children smuggled bread through holes in the wall, mothers whispered lullabies to hide the sound of hunger, and men who had once been scholars or shopkeepers now traded their wedding rings for a single potato. But beneath that silence, something else was growing. Not fear, defiance. In the ruins of Warsaw, where hope was supposed to die, ordinary people began to prepare for the impossible. With stolen pistols, homemade grenades, and sheer willpower, they would face the most powerful army on earth. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a declaration that even in the darkest place ever built by man, the human spirit could still burn brighter than fire. This is the story of the Warsaw Ghetto, the place where death was certain, but surrender was not. Chapter 1. The Fall of Warsaw, 1939. Birth of occupation. It began with a scream that seemed to echo through all of Europe. In September 1939, Warsaw woke up to the sound of the sky tearing apart. Stukas, German dive bombers, sliced through the morning clouds, their sirens shrieking like death itself. Windows shattered. Churches collapsed. Streets that had seen centuries of peace were suddenly painted with fire. The city's proud skyline, once a symbol of Poland's independence, was now disappearing beneath smoke and rubble. In less than a week, the invasion that Hitler had promised as a defensive action revealed its true face, a deliberate act of destruction, meant not to conquer Poland's army, but to crush its soul. The German Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, was a strategy unlike anything the world had seen before. Fast-moving tanks, armored vehicles, and precision bombers worked together like the limbs of one monstrous machine. Poland's cavalry, brave but outmatched, rode into battles where bullets met horsemen. Within days, communication lines were shattered, supply chains severed, and entire regiments cut off. Warsaw, the heart of the nation, became an island under siege. Its defenders, soldiers, police, and even civilians dug trenches in parks and gardens. Every intersection became a fortress. Every rooftop, a target. The Luftwaffe ruled the air. Bombers returned again and again, methodically turning neighborhoods into dust. Civilians huddled in basements, clutching their children as walls trembled. The air was thick with smoke and the bitter smell of burning oil. Hospitals overflowed. Priests performed last rites by candlelight. And yet, through the chaos, Warsaw refused to surrender. For nearly 3 weeks, the city held on, firing back against the inevitable. In the streets, young boys carried ammunition between barricades. Women formed human chains to pass buckets of water to firefighters who had no hope of controlling the flames. As days turned to weeks, hunger began its own quiet war. Bread vanished. Water grew scarce. The dead were buried in courtyards because cemeteries were unreachable. Yet still Warsaw stood. Hitler grew furious at this defiance. To him, Warsaw was supposed to be an example, proof that resistance to Germany meant annihilation. He ordered his generals to flatten the city completely. The final bombardment began on September 25th, known forever as Black Monday. Over 1,000 tons of bombs fell within 24 hours. The sky itself seemed to burn. Witnesses described it as if the world were ending. And in some ways, it was the end of free Poland, the end of a generation's hope. When the smoke cleared, Warsaw was unrecognizable. Nearly every building had been hit. Streets were choked with debris. The wounded lay in doorways, calling out for water that no one had left to give. With communications severed and the army decimated, the city's mayor, Stefan Starzinski, who had become a symbol of resistance, was forced to make an impossible decision. On September 27th, Warsaw capitulated. German troops entered the city the next day. Civilians lined the streets in silence, watching as tanks rolled past. For the first time in centuries, their capital was under foreign occupation. To many, It was a quiet apocalypse. The Polish flag was torn down from government buildings. German banners went up overnight. The occupation began with precision: registers, orders, checkpoints. But beneath this cold efficiency lay something darker. Hitler's vision for Poland was not one of coexistence or even control. It was eradication. The country was to be stripped of identity, its people reduced to labor, and its Jewish population marked for elimination. Nazi ideology had long cast Jews as the root of Europe's decay. Now, in the ashes of Warsaw, that hatred found its laboratory. The city's Jewish population, nearly 400,000 people, a third of Warsaw's citizens, immediately became targets of new decrees. Jewish-owned shops were seized. Synagogues were desecrated. Street signs changed names overnight, replacing Polish words with German. Posters warned that anyone aiding a Jew would be shot. It began with humiliation. Jews were forced to scrub streets, bow to soldiers, wear armbands with the blue Star of David. But humiliation was only the first step. The Nazis were testing obedience, measuring fear, deciding how far they could go before the city broke. The German occupiers established a new government called the General Government, headquartered in Krakow, which would administer central Poland as a colony. For Warsaw, this meant an entirely new reality. German soldiers were everywhere, on street corners, in apartments, even in schools. Curfews silenced the nights. Polish books were burned. Radios were confiscated. Public gatherings were outlawed. What had once been a city of cafes, universities, and theaters was now a prison of rules. But under this iron order, an invisible resistance was already forming. Underground newspapers, secret schools, and coded letters began to circulate. People whispered in stairwells, passing information as though it were contraband. Outside the city, the world watched but did not intervene. Britain and France had declared war on Germany, but no help came for Poland. The promised allies remained distant voices on the radio. In late September, Soviet forces entered Poland from the east, sealing its fate. The country was split between two dictatorships. Warsaw, now in German hands, became both a symbol and a laboratory, a test ground for Nazi racial policies that would soon consume all of Europe. In the early months of occupation, the Nazis began systematically dismantling Warsaw's Jewish life. Schools closed. Newspapers were banned. Rabbis were arrested. Entire professions, doctors, lawyers, artists, were erased overnight. Yet even in this darkness, life tried to continue. Black markets sprang up in alleys. Teachers held lessons in secret basements. Families gathered for hidden prayers, whispering Hebrew blessings that defied the silence of oppression. The winter of 1939 was harsh. Snow covered the ruins, and hunger became an enemy stronger than the soldiers on the street. German patrols shot anyone found outside during curfew. People learned to read fear the way they once read weather. The shuffle of boots meant raids. The barking of dogs meant someone would not return. But amid the terror, there were still flickers of humanity. Polish neighbors risked their lives to hide Jewish friends. In one apartment, a mother taught her children to never cry, because even a sound could bring death to the door. The Nazis began confiscating Jewish property under the guise of order. Homes were cleared out in hours, furniture tossed into the street, photographs trampled under boots. The goal was not efficiency, it was humiliation. Officers watched as families carried what little they could. Some begged to keep their wedding rings. Others held on to books, believing knowledge could not be stolen. But the Germans were not merely taking possessions, they were taking away identity. Each decree stripped away another piece of humanity. By December, the first rumors of segregation began to spread. Jewish residents were told to move into certain districts for their own protection. Few understood that these would soon become prisons. Still, many obeyed, partly out of fear, partly because resistance seemed impossible. Warsaw's Jewish community, which had thrived for centuries with vibrant synagogues, libraries, and theaters, was being slowly erased from the map. Meanwhile, the Gestapo began its reign of terror. Arrests came without warning. Intellectuals, priests, and community leaders disappeared overnight. Torture chambers were set up in former police stations. Every scream behind those walls sent a message to the rest of the city: obedience or death. The Nazis wanted not just to control Warsaw, but to break its will, to crush the idea that freedom could ever return. By the start of 1940, Warsaw was a ghost of its former self. German officials now referred to it as a problem city. Too many people, too much resistance, too many Jews. Plans were drawn up to isolate the Jewish population completely. Maps were marked with red lines that would soon become walls. The phrase Jewish quarter entered official documents. The machinery of segregation, which would later evolve into the machinery of extermination, had begun turning quietly behind the scenes. And yet, even in this nightmare, some dared to hope. Underground groups began forming, often led by former soldiers or students. They forged identity papers, smuggled messages, and documented the crimes they witnessed. One of them, Emanuel Ringelblum, began gathering records of daily life under occupation, diaries, notes, drawings, believing that someday the truth must be known. His secret project, codenamed Oneg Shabbat, would become one of the most important testimonies of the Holocaust. But as the walls of oppression closed in, Warsaw's Jewish community could not yet imagine what was coming. They had survived pogroms before. They believed this too would pass. They could not yet see that the ghetto, the trains, and the camps were already being planned in offices not far away. In the quiet before the storm, the city seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers patrolled. Children scavenged for food. Life went on in fragments. And somewhere in the German command posts, blueprints were being drawn, plans that would turn the heart of Warsaw into a walled graveyard. The fall of the city was only the beginning. The true siege, the one against its people, its spirit, and its very existence, was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Walls Go Up, 1940. Birth of the Ghetto. It started with rumors, quiet at first, whispered through the cramped streets of occupied Warsaw. People said the Germans were planning something new, something bigger than the raids or the curfews. No one could quite believe it. The city had already suffered the invasion, the occupation, and the daily humiliation of the soldiers' boots on their streets. But this was different. It wasn't another order or decree. It was a sentence, the separation of life itself. The Jews of Warsaw were to be locked away, walled off from the rest of the city. And not just for weeks or months, forever. By the spring of 1940, the Nazi bureaucracy moved like a cold machine. Orders were signed in German offices, stamped, filed, and passed down the chain of command with chilling precision. The decision came from Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, who saw Warsaw's Jews not as citizens, but as a biological problem. His subordinates called it the solution to urban disorder. On October 12, 1940, the order became official. All Jews in Warsaw, over 400,000 men, women, and children, were to move into a designated area. The rest of the city's residents, nearly 100,000 Poles, were to move out. No one could grasp the scale of it. Soldiers and police arrived at doorsteps, reading names from lists. Entire families were told to pack what they could carry and leave their homes within hours. Grandmothers who had lived in the same apartment for decades watched strangers claim their furniture. Businesses that had survived the first wave of occupation now closed forever. And while people wept and packed their belongings, the sound of hammers echoed in the distance. Workers, mostly Jewish laborers under guard, were building walls. Tall, thick walls of brick and concrete, 12 miles long, cutting through streets, dividing neighborhoods, slicing families in half. The first wall went up along Kladna Street. To those outside, it looked like an ordinary construction project. To those inside, it was the beginning of imprisonment. The Nazis called it a resettlement measure. The locals called it what it truly was, the ghetto. And soon, that word would carry the weight of hell itself. Inside the designated zone, the population density skyrocketed overnight. Before the wall, Warsaw's Jewish population had already been crammed into poor districts. Now the boundaries made those streets feel like cages. 10 people to a room became normal. Apartments meant for 2 families now held 10. Toilets overflowed. Water was rationed. The air grew heavy with the stench of sewage and sweat. In the summer heat, diseases spread faster than news. Typhus became an epidemic. The Germans used it as propaganda, calling the Jews unclean and blaming them for the very misery they had created. The wall was not just physical, it was psychological. For many, the idea of never leaving, of being cut off from the city that was once theirs, was unbearable. The sound of bricks being laid each day became a kind of slow funeral march. You could hear in the distance, hammer, brick, mortar, silence. Some tried to escape before the walls closed completely. They bribed guards, crawled through sewers, disguised themselves as Polish laborers. But most stayed. They believed the German promises that it was temporary, that it was for health and safety, that cooperation might protect them. They still thought there were limits to cruelty. They didn't yet know that those limits did not exist. By November 16, 1940, the gates of the Warsaw Ghetto were locked. Wooden signs with skull symbols warned in both Polish and German. No entry without permission. Epidemic area. On that day, a third of Warsaw's population was sealed inside an area covering less than 3% of the city. What had been a thriving urban capital turned into a cage of suffering. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Towers went up. Every crossing point became a checkpoint, manned by armed soldiers and local police. Inside, daily life began to warp around the new reality. Food became the most precious currency. The official German rations for Jews were so small, they amounted to starvation, barely enough to survive for a few weeks. The numbers told a story of cruelty disguised as policy. 2,000 calories a day for Germans, 700 for Poles, and less than 200 for Jews. It was, quite literally, a slow death sentence written in numbers. To live, people had to smuggle. Children, small enough to crawl through cracks in the wall or squeeze through drains, became the lifeline of the ghetto. They carried bread, potatoes, even scraps of paper from the outside. Many were caught and shot on sight. Yet they kept coming, day after day, risking everything for a loaf of bread. The Judenrat, the Jewish council appointed by the Nazis, was supposed to administer the ghetto. Its head, Adam Cherniakow, was a man trapped between duty and despair. He tried to negotiate, to soften the cruelty, to protect his people within an impossible system. His diaries would later reveal the torment of his position. How every order he followed meant the suffering of others. How every refusal meant punishment. He wrote, "They demand the impossible, and we must deliver it." The Germans forced the council to organize labor, maintain order, and even manage deportations later on. It was a cruel, psychological trick, making the victims responsible for their own imprisonment. As the months passed, the ghetto began to form its own society. Schools were banned, but teachers held secret classes. Synagogues were closed, yet prayers continued in hidden rooms. Musicians performed in courtyards. Doctors operated in basements with no anesthesia. Life, in defiance of everything, refused to vanish. The Ringelblum archive continued to collect documents, receipts, letters, drawings, evidence of a world trying to stay human inside an inhuman cage. The ghetto economy was strange and fragile. Officially, Jews were forbidden from owning businesses or trading freely. Unofficially, the black market ruled everything. Smuggling tunnels ran beneath the walls. Currency shifted daily, but cigarettes became a kind of standard. People sold whatever they had left, clothes, jewelry, family heirlooms, for a few days' worth of food. The poorest scavenged through garbage heaps or waited at soup kitchens run by aid organizations like the Jewish Social Self-Help and the American Joint Distribution Committee, both struggling to survive under German restrictions. The Germans maintained the illusion of order. Posters announced regulations. Inspections were routine. Patrols arrested anyone caught with smuggled goods. Those who resisted or broke curfew were shot in the streets, their bodies left as warnings. Yet beneath this manufactured control, tension simmered. People began to realize that the ghetto was not a temporary measure. It was a step towards something darker, though no one yet knew its full shape. By 1941, the wall had become both a border and a symbol. The Germans used it to isolate, but also to dehumanize. To the outside world, it became easier to forget what was happening inside. The wall made the suffering invisible. On the Polish side, life went on: streetcars, markets, music. On the Jewish side, starvation, disease, and despair. Only the faint sounds of life carried over: the crying of children, the rumble of carts carrying the dead to mass graves. The Germans began turning the ghetto into a labor camp. Workshops were established to produce goods for the Reich: uniforms, boots, and tools. Workers were given slightly better rations, enough to keep them alive but weak. The illusion of purpose was intentional. The Nazis wanted to extract every ounce of labor before death. Factories filled with the smell of leather, oil, and sweat. For many, it was the only way to avoid starvation or deportation. Outside the walls, rumors of extermination camps began to spread. People heard about mass shootings in the countryside, about trains that left but never returned. In the ghetto, disbelief clung to hope. They can't kill us all, some said. They need our work. But deep down, fear was growing. Chernyakov's diary entries became shorter, more despairing. He described the Germans' constant demands for labor quotas, taxes, and lists of names. He sensed that every order was a prelude to something worse. The physical environment of the ghetto was deteriorating fast. Sanitation collapsed entirely. Piles of waste filled the streets. Flies swarmed. The stench of death was inescapable. Coffins became scarce, and mass graves were dug daily. Photographs from that time, taken secretly by brave witnesses, show gaunt faces, hollow eyes, children with swollen bellies. Yet, even those images fail to capture the scale of human suffering. Music and art, paradoxically, thrived in this abyss. Street performers sang in exchange for bread. Poets wrote verses on scraps of paper, hiding them under floorboards. Painters recorded what they saw: the starvation, the violence, the fleeting moments of beauty. These acts of creation were a form of rebellion. Every brushstroke, every note played, was a way of saying, "We are still alive." The Germans, of course, noticed. They began controlling even the ghetto's culture. Propaganda films were made to show the normal life inside: smiling workers, children at play, carefully staged scenes designed to deceive foreign observers. Behind those images, thousands were dying each month. The Nazis were already experimenting with how to hide genocide in plain sight. In the summer of 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union intensified the Nazi radicalism across occupied Europe. Hitler's war in the East was not only military, it was ideological. He called it a war of extermination. In Warsaw, the policies hardened further. The SS took greater control. Food rations were cut again. Random executions increased. Those who could still think about the future began to ask a terrifying question: if this is life, what will death look like? By the end of that year, nearly 100,000 people had died inside the ghetto, mostly from hunger and disease. Yet new arrivals kept coming. Jews from nearby towns were deported to Warsaw, as other ghettos were liquidated. The population swelled beyond capacity. The wall seemed to close in tighter with every passing day. In some areas, the crowding reached absurd levels: 15 people to a single room, entire families sleeping in stairwells. The ghetto was no longer a city. It was a waiting room for death. Despite it all, the spirit of resistance began to take root. The youth movements, Homer Hatzer, Dror, Akiva, secretly organized meetings. They distributed pamphlets calling for dignity, for unity, for preparation. Weapons were impossible to find, but words became their first defense. Some even smuggled in news from the outside, about Britain's resilience, about the Soviet fight back, about the whispers of hope. The ghetto was starving, but it was not silent. In July 1942, the first trains began to roll out of the Umschlagplatz, the loading area near Stocky Street. The Germans said the people were being resettled to the east. Families gathered with bundles, believing they might find work elsewhere. Few noticed that the doors of the train cars locked from the outside. Fewer still knew the name of the destination, Treblinka. But before those trains became the nightmare of the Holocaust, the walls of the ghetto had already done their job. They had contained, isolated, and broken an entire community. The experiment in total control was complete. The Warsaw Ghetto had been built in less than a year, but it would take only months to destroy it. And as the final bricks were cemented, sealing the last cracks of freedom, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. The air inside the ghetto hung heavy with despair, but also with something else, an ember of defiance, faint but unextinguished. No one could know yet that one day, those same walls would echo with gunfire not of oppression, but of revolt. The walls that were built to imprison would one day become the battlefield of the brave. Chapter 3. Life Behind the Walls, Struggle for Survival. The first thing that struck people inside the Warsaw Ghetto was the silence after the gates closed. The sound of the outside world, trams, bells, conversations in Polish, faded into memory. Only the shuffle of boots and the echo of carts remained. It was as if the city itself had been split in two, one side alive, the other buried. Inside the walls, more than 400,000 people found themselves trapped in less than 3 square miles. The air was thick with dust and despair. The walls weren't just made of brick, they were made of fear. At first, many tried to pretend life could continue. Schools reopened in secret apartments. Markets appeared in courtyards. People exchanged old banknotes for food, clothes, anything that might help them last one more week. The human instinct to adapt was fierce, but the conditions defied it. Overcrowding was unbearable. Families shared rooms so tight that there was barely space to lie down. The smell of sweat and coal smoke filled every stairwell. In winter, frost crept in through cracked windows, biting into the thin blankets people used to keep warm. In summer, the heat became suffocating, the stench of waste and rot clinging to every wall. Hunger became the rhythm of life. The official food rations given by the Germans amounted to starvation, barely a few ounces of bread a day. People learned to measure time not by days, but by meals or the absence of them. Mothers boiled potato peels into soup. Fathers sold their last possessions for a few crumbs. The children who once laughed in schoolyards now scoured garbage piles. Many starved slowly, their faces hollowing, eyes sinking into skulls. Hunger was a thief. It took strength, hope, and even the will to move. And yet, somehow, people still try to live. Smuggling became the ghetto's lifeline. It was the most dangerous and essential trade imaginable. Through cracks in the walls, holes in the bricks, and hidden tunnels, children risked their lives to bring in food from the outside. They moved like shadows, barefoot, silent, invisible. The smallest ones were prized because they could fit through spaces no adult could follow. Every trip meant a chance at survival, and every trip could end with a bullet. German guards often shot to kill, their rifles echoing through the streets. Still, the children kept coming back. In a place where starvation was the law, smuggling became an act of rebellion. Inside the ghetto, a strange duality took shape. There were those who starved, and those who managed to survive through connections, trade, or sheer luck. Cafes still operated, where musicians played for crumbs and actors performed sketches to keep spirits alive. It seemed absurd, art and laughter amid death, but perhaps it was necessary. The human soul needs something to cling to, even in the darkest pit. The cafes were crowded not just with the living, but with the illusion of normalcy. People drank coffee made from roasted barley, smoked paper cigarettes, and pretended for an hour that life was still theirs to own. The Judenrat, or Jewish Council, tried to maintain order under German control. Its leader, Adam Cherniakow, lived in a constant state of torment. He He received daily orders from German officials, lists of workers, materials, taxes, and he knew refusal meant death. He walked the narrow line between survival and complicity. Some accused him of collaborating with the enemy. Others saw him as a man trapped by impossible choices. He wrote in his diary about the endless demands, the arrests, the exhaustion of trying to save lives in a system designed for death. His words revealed a man quietly breaking under the weight of his duty. As winter returned, disease became an enemy as deadly as hunger. Typhus spread like wildfire through the cramped streets. Fleas and lice carried it from body to body. Doctors fought to contain it, but medicine was scarce. Hospitals were overflowing, corridors lined with the dying. The smell of sickness and disinfectant clung to everything. Yet, even amid this horror, the doctors continued their work. They performed autopsies, kept records, studied malnutrition. They believed that one day, their findings might stir the living. It was science in the service of hope, conducted in a place where hope barely existed. Funerals became part of daily life. At first, the dead were buried in cemeteries. Then the numbers grew too high. Corpses were left in courtyards, covered with newspapers. Carts rolled through the streets each morning to collect them, like trash. Death lost its meaning when it came so often. Children stepped over bodies on their way to school. People stopped crying. Tears wasted energy. But in the silence of the nights, when the city slept uneasily, you could still hear muffled sobs behind shuttered windows. And yet, even here, humanity refused to vanish. Teachers continued to hold secret classes, teaching history, literature, mathematics. They believed that knowledge was a form of resistance. That education was the one thing the Nazis could not confiscate. In dark basements, children whispered poems about freedom. Young artists painted scenes of life beyond the wall. Musicians composed songs that mixed sorrow with defiance. A pianist named the Ladislaw Spillman played for survival, his music drifting through the cracked walls like a prayer. Every note defied the silence imposed by fear. The Germans maintained a calculated cruelty. They allowed just enough life to persist, so they could exploit it. Factories were built within the ghetto where Jews made uniforms, boots, and other supplies for the German army. Workers received slightly better rations, just enough to stay alive. They were told they were essential. It was another lie, one designed to buy time until the extermination could begin. Still, those jobs meant life, at least for a while. People clung to them desperately, even as they watched neighbors disappear in the night. The black market became the beating heart of survival. It ran beneath the official order, invisible and vital. Everything was traded: bread, sugar, cigarettes, news, and sometimes hope itself. A few became wealthy from it, wielding power in the shadows. Others despised them, calling them profiteers. But in truth, the black market was not greed, it was survival. Without it, the ghetto would have collapsed long before the Germans decided to destroy it. Every loaf of bread smuggled in was a small victory against the plan to starve an entire people out of existence. The spiritual life of the ghetto persisted in secret. Rabbis held prayers in basements. Torah scrolls were hidden behind false walls. Weddings were conducted quietly, with no music, only whispers of vows. Babies were born in fear, but also in faith. Parents gave them names that meant hope, freedom, life. To have a child in such a place was the ultimate act of defiance, a statement that the future still existed, even if the present did not. Not everyone could endure. Suicide became common. The despair was overwhelming, and the knowledge that escape was impossible broke many. Chernyakov himself would later take his own life, when faced with an order he could not obey. But before that moment, he and others tried to preserve some sense of community. Orphanages, soup kitchens, and welfare centers were established. Those supplies were nearly non-existent. Dr. Janusz Korczak, a beloved educator, ran an orphanage within the ghetto. He refused to abandon the children even when he was offered freedom. His story would later become one of the most haunting examples of moral courage in the Holocaust. Every day inside the ghetto was a negotiation with death. People learned to read the moods of soldiers, to sense danger in footsteps, to hide valuables in walls or under floorboards. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. Informers lurked everywhere, some out of greed, others out of terror. The Gestapo's reach extended into every block. One knock on the door could mean the end. But there were also small miracles, moments that made survival bearable. A child finding a crust of bread and bringing it to a parent. A doctor saving a life with a stolen dose of medicine. Lovers holding hands in the shadows of the wall, dreaming of a world beyond it. The Germans could cage their bodies, but not their imaginations. In the quiet of the night, people still dared to imagine freedom. The Ringelblum archive grew during these years. Historians, writers, and teachers risked their lives to document what was happening. They collected reports, testimonies, drawings, and letters, sealing them in metal boxes and milk cans buried beneath the streets. They wanted the future to know the truth, to know that Warsaw had not gone quietly into the night. Their work was a time capsule of courage, buried under rubble, but destined to speak long after they were gone. Outside the walls, the rest of Warsaw watched with unease. Some Poles helped, smuggling food and messages into the ghetto. Others turned away, afraid or indifferent. The city was divided not just by walls, but by conscience. The Germans intended it that way. They wanted the ghetto to disappear from memory, even as it stood in plain sight. For them, it was a laboratory of death, an experiment in how far cruelty could be mechanized. By 1942, the illusion of control was slipping. Rumors reached the ghetto that something far worse was coming. The Germans spoke of resettlement, but those who listened closely knew it was a lie. Trains were being prepared, rail lines repaired. People began to vanish from smaller ghettos around Poland. The word Treblinka started to circulate, an unknown place, a destination without return. Fear spread quietly, like an infection of the soul. The children who once smuggled bread now smuggled news. They whispered of mass graves, of camps where no one came back. But in the ghetto, disbelief still offered protection. People clung to routine, because to face the truth was unbearable. They told themselves the deportations were for labor, that families would be reunited later. The Germans encouraged the illusion. They posted notices promising better conditions, work, even food. Hope became a trap. By the summer of 1942, starvation had become normal. People no longer noticed the dead in the streets. A man could collapse in a doorway, and the crowd would step around him. Death was no longer an event. It was part of the landscape. The ghetto had reached the limit of endurance. And yet, somewhere beneath that despair, something else was stirring. Anger. The realization that cooperation would not save them. The understanding that submission only delayed the inevitable. The seeds of resistance began to take root in this hopeless soil. Young men and women who had grown up under occupation started to talk about fighting back. They had no weapons, no army, no chance, but they had nothing left to lose. The hunger that once weakened them now hardened them. They whispered in cellars and attics, forming groups, writing manifestos, teaching each other to shoot. It began not as a plan for victory, but as a promise that they would not die without dignity. The walls that had once kept them imprisoned were about to become their battleground. The same bricks that silenced them would soon echo with gunfire. But that moment was still to come. For now, the ghetto lived in the long shadow of waiting. Waiting for rescue that never came. Waiting for orders that always brought death. Waiting for the day when the silence would finally break. And when it did, the world would never forget the sound. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Hunger. The Nazi Starvation Policy. Hunger had become more than a condition inside the Warsaw Ghetto. It was a weapon. The Germans didn't just starve the Jews because of neglect. They starved them by design. It was policy, calculated and deliberate, another cog in the machinery of annihilation. By 1941, the Nazi administration had turned food into a means of control. They called it rationing. In truth, It was execution by slow starvation. The ghetto was to be cleansed not by bullets or gas, but by hunger itself. Every resident inside the walls lived under a mathematical death sentence. The rations allotted to Jews equaled less than 200 calories per day, barely a piece of bread, a spoonful of watery soup. Germans stationed in Warsaw received over 2,000 calories. Poles, living under occupation but outside the walls, received about 700. The hierarchy of humanity was written in numbers, cold and bureaucratic. To the Nazi officials, it was a simple equation. Jews were deemed subhuman, and therefore undeserving of survival. To them, hunger wasn't cruelty, it was policy efficiency. Each morning began with the same ritual. People lined up outside food distribution points, clutching ration cards that had long since lost meaning. They waited for hours in freezing air or summer dust, hoping for bread that often never arrived. When it did, it was made of sawdust, flour, and ground-up straw. Sometimes it was moldy, sometimes it wasn't bread at all, but imitation loaves that crumbled to powder at the first touch. Mothers tore pieces apart carefully, trying to make it last for their children. Every bite became a calculation of endurance. How to eat enough to survive today, yet save something for tomorrow. The body began to change quickly. Skin clung to bone. Eyes sank into hollow sockets. Men who had once been proud and strong now moved like ghosts. Women's faces lost shape, becoming skeletal masks. Children stopped growing. Their bellies swelled with malnutrition, their limbs thin as sticks. Hunger took away more than flesh. It took away thought. It dulled the mind until even fear faded into a slow, dreamlike emptiness. People would wander the streets in silence, too weak to beg. The smell of decay followed them, mixed with the stench of refuse and rot. The ghetto's air was thick, heavy, almost physical, a mixture of smoke, disease, and hunger itself. The Germans monitored everything. They measured how much food entered, how many calories were distributed, how many people died each week. Reports were written with clinical detachment, listing deaths from natural causes that were anything but natural. Starvation was organized, documented, and refined like an experiment. Nazi economists saw it as a method to reduce the unproductive population. The SS officers overseeing the ghetto learned to use food as currency, rewards for obedience, punishments for resistance. A loaf of bread could buy silence, cooperation, even betrayal. Inside the ghetto, people built an entire economy around survival. Food became more valuable than gold. A few managed to smuggle supplies from outside. The smugglers, often children, became the city's unseen heroes. They crawled through narrow tunnels, crept along rooftops, slipped past guards with sacks of potatoes or onions strapped to their backs. Many never returned. Those who did became lifelines for their families and neighbors. It was said that every loaf of bread smuggled and cost a child's life somewhere along the wall. And yet the flow never stopped. Hunger was an unstoppable force, but so was the will to live. The black market flourished. It was illegal, dangerous, and essential. Every corner of the ghetto had its own traders and brokers. The rich, those who still possessed valuables, rings, watches, furs, could trade for food. The poor had nothing left to sell. They bartered with labor, bodies, or memories. Women sold their last possessions, and sometimes their dignity, for scraps of bread. Children offered to carry loads for a crust. The entire ghetto became a twisted reflection of society, its morals inverted, its values rewritten by starvation. The streets of the ghetto told the story without words. Emaciated figures sat against the walls, eyes glazed, lips cracked, hands outstretched. Some begged silently. Others had no strength even for that. The carts came each morning to collect the dead. They moved slowly, wheels creaking under the weight of corpses wrapped in rags. The dead were taken to mass graves, their names often unrecorded. Passers-by looked away, not out of cruelty, but self-preservation. In a world ruled by hunger, empathy became dangerous. To feel too much was to break. Children suffered the most. They were the first to weaken, the first to die. Their small bodies could not endure the slow torture of malnutrition. Parents faced impossible choices, whether to eat their portion or give it to their child. Many starved themselves so their children might live one more day. Some even smothered their babies to spare them a longer death. These were not acts of despair, but of mercy, in a place where mercy had become a crime. Yet, even amid this horror, humanity flickered. Soup kitchens run by Jewish welfare organizations tried to feed the most desperate. The meals were little more than hot water with a trace of vegetables, but they offered warmth, company, and dignity. Volunteers risked punishment to organize them. Doctors and nurses continued their work despite lacking medicine, using knowledge as their last weapon against death. They recorded the effects of starvation meticulously, not for science's sake, but for history, to prove to the world that what was happening here was not fate, but murder. One of those doctors, Dr. Israel Milichkowski, documented the stages of starvation in harrowing detail. First came the weakness, then dizziness, then apathy. The body began consuming itself. Muscles dissolved, organs shrank, and the heart slowed until it could no longer sustain life. Death was usually quiet. The victims simply stopped moving, as if sleep had claimed them. Milichkowski's notes survived the war, buried in milk cans with the Ringelblum archive. They were testimonies of resistance through truth, a record of crimes too immense to be erased by silence. The Germans pretended that starvation was natural, that it was the consequence of Jewish laziness or overpopulation. In reality, they controlled every calorie that entered the ghetto. They cut supply lines, confiscated shipments, and banned outside aid. They even taxed the dead, charging families for burial. Their cruelty was systematic, precise, and utterly indifferent. To them, this was efficiency. To those inside the walls, it was hell designed by accountants. But starvation did something the Germans hadn't expected. It exposed the extremes of both evil and goodness in human nature. Some became predators, hoarding food and exploiting others. Others became saints, sharing their last crumbs with strangers. In every courtyard, stories of kindness coexisted with stories of betrayal. One woman, known only as Miriam, fed dozens of orphans by boiling weeds from the ghetto gardens. A tailor named Moshe shared his ration bread with a neighbor every night until he collapsed from exhaustion. These acts of compassion glowed like embers in the dark, small and fleeting, but unforgettable. For the Nazis, hunger was also a test of obedience. They used it to control the Judenrat, to ensure compliance with orders. When the Germans demanded more laborers for their factories, they promised food in return. When they wanted lists of names for deportation, they hinted at better rations for cooperation. Every negotiation was poisoned by hunger. It was no longer about life or death, but about who would die first. By the end of 1941, the population of the ghetto had shrunk drastically. Tens of thousands were gone, some to disease, some to bullets, most to hunger. But the numbers meant nothing compared to the faces. Photographs taken secretly by members of the Jewish underground show scenes, so haunting they seem almost unreal. Skeletons walking upright, mothers holding children too weak to cry, men digging graves for neighbors with bare hands. Every image is a wound carved into time. The Germans used starvation to break the spirit of the people, but they failed to understand something fundamental. The human will does not vanish easily. Even as death claimed thousands, people still dreamed of freedom. They wrote poetry, staged plays, painted murals. They buried letters and diaries beneath the streets, messages for the world beyond the wall. "We are still human," one note read. "Remember us." It was an act of defiance more powerful than any weapon. In those same years, the outside world remained largely silent. The Polish underground tried to send information about the conditions inside the ghetto, but few believed it. The scale of suffering was unimaginable to those who had never seen it. Even among Allied governments, reports of deliberate starvation were dismissed as exaggerations. The ghetto's walls not only imprisoned bodies, they muffled the truth. Winter returned with renewed cruelty. Snow fell softly on the corpses in the streets, covering them like shrouds. Children huddled around fires made from furniture and torn books. The sound of cracking wood mixed with the moans of the dying. The ghetto had become a world where time itself seemed to have stopped. People no longer marked days or months. They measured survival in breaths, in crumbs, in heartbeats. And then, one day, something shifted. Whispers spread that the Germans were planning something new, something final. Officials from the SS began visiting the ghetto more frequently. Lists were demanded, inspections increased, and the word resettlement began appearing in orders. The Judenrat was told to prepare people for transfer to work camps in the East. Few understood what that meant, but hunger made it hard to question. The promise of food elsewhere was enough to make many obey. The starvation policy had achieved its purpose. The people were weakened, broken, desperate. Resistance seemed impossible. When the trains finally arrived in the summer of 1942, most boarded them willingly, clutching the small rations they had been given. They believed they were being moved to better conditions, to work, perhaps even to live. They did not know the destination's name, Treblinka. They did not know that the hunger they had endured was only the first stage of a larger plan, a plan to erase them entirely. In the weeks before those deportations began, a few realized the truth. Underground newspapers published warnings. Resistance groups urged people not to go. But starvation had dulled the will to fight. Many were too weak to run. Entire families lined up at the Umschlagplatz, the loading area near Stocky Street, waiting under the sun for trains that would never return. German officers handed out bread as they boarded, a cruel gesture of deceit. "See," one SS man joked, "there is food in the East." The trains rolled out, day after day, filled with the silent victims of hunger. Their empty homes were looted, their belongings sorted, their lives reduced to ledgers. Inside the ghetto, those who remained wandered through the deserted streets, stunned by the emptiness. The smell of death lingered, mixed with the scent of stale bread. They had survived starvation only to face extermination. And yet, even in this final descent, a spark remained. The survivors began to understand that hunger was not a side effect of war, but a weapon of genocide. They saw through the lies, the manipulation, the false promises. They began to realize that survival itself was resistance, that to live, even one more day, was to defy the system built to erase them. From that realization, a new kind of courage began to form. It was fragile at first, like the flicker of a candle in the wind, but it would grow. The same people who had been starved, humiliated, and broken would soon rise with weapons in their hands. Hunger had taken their strength, but not their resolve. The Germans had built the ghetto to destroy their humanity. Instead, it had revealed its depth. And though the bodies inside the walls were frail, their spirit was beginning to awaken. As the winter of 1942 gave way to spring, the rumble of trains still echoed in the distance. But beneath the silence of the starving streets, something new was stirring. Anger, unity, purpose. The Nazis had thought hunger would make them obedient. They were wrong. It had made them unafraid of death. And soon, the city that had been choked by hunger would roar back to life in defiance, with the fire of rebellion that no starvation could extinguish. Chapter 5. Echoes of Resistance. The first acts of defiance. At first, resistance inside the Warsaw Ghetto did not come with guns or grenades. It began as whispers. Whispers in stairwells, in courtyards, in the cramped corners of secret classrooms. People spoke quietly, afraid that even the walls might betray them. After years of starvation, disease, and humiliation, hope had been buried under the rubble of despair. Yet somewhere beneath the hunger and fear, something began to stir, a question that spread from heart to heart. What if we stopped waiting to die? The deportations of the summer of 1942 had shattered whatever illusions of safety remained. In a matter of weeks, more than 260,000 Jews were taken from Warsaw and sent to Treblinka. The Germans called it resettlement. But the few who escaped the trains brought back the truth. Treblinka was not a camp. It was a death factory. People were not going east to work. They were going east to vanish. The ghetto, once a city of 400,000 souls, had been reduced to barely 50,000. Those who remained knew now that survival through obedience was an illusion. Every list, every promise, every ration card had been a lie. The silence that followed the Great Deportation was unbearable. The streets that had once been crowded with the hungry and desperate were now empty. Entire families had disappeared. Buildings stood hollow, their windows gaping like open wounds. The air was heavy with absence. For those who had survived, there was no longer any middle ground. It was a choice between resistance or extinction. And slowly, the decision began to take shape. The first seeds of organized resistance came from the youth movements. Before the war, these groups had been about education, culture, and identity. Zionist scouts, socialist clubs, student associations. Now, they became the backbone of rebellion. Groups like Hashomer Hatzair, Dror, Akiva, and Paleizim began to meet in secret again, not to discuss philosophy or religion, but to plan survival. Many of their members were barely 20 years old. They had grown up behind the walls, watched their families die, and decided that if death was inevitable, it would not be passive. Mordecai Anielewicz was one of them. He was a young man with sharp eyes and a quiet intensity, a leader by instinct more than position. Before the war, he had been a schoolteacher, idealistic and kind. Now he moved through the ruins like a shadow, organizing, recruiting, and dreaming of the impossible, armed resistance inside the ghetto. He knew they had almost no weapons, no training, no allies. But he also knew something the Germans did not. A people who have lost everything can become unstoppable. The first attempts at resistance were not battles, but acts of preservation. They smuggled in books, banned newspapers, and typewriters. Underground presses printed leaflets exposing German lies, describing Treblinka, urging people to resist. These papers circulated hand to hand, passed like sacred texts, each one a spark of defiance in a world of silence. They told the truth at a time when truth was more dangerous than bullets. One leaflet read, "Do not let them deceive you. Those who go to the trains go to their deaths. Better to fall with a weapon in hand than enter their gas chambers." Weapons were almost impossible to find. The Germans had stripped the Jewish population of everything that could be used for defense. A knife was a luxury, a pistol a miracle. Yet, through the black market, through Polish contacts, through sheer desperation, they began to gather what they could. One gun, then two, then 10. Each piece was hidden beneath floorboards, inside walls, under piles of coal. Every bullet was treated like gold. The fighters began to train with wooden replicas, memorizing the weight and movement of weapons they did not yet have. The Polish underground, the Armia Krajowa, was cautious about helping. Anti-Semitism was still strong, even among some of those who resisted the Germans. Yet there were brave individuals who understood the truth of what was happening. They smuggled weapons, maps, and training manuals into the ghetto, often at the risk of death. The price of a pistol was astronomical, but it was paid in diamonds, gold, or whatever valuables remained hidden from German searches. Each delivery was a lifeline, each act of aid a defiance of Hitler's vision of division. The organization that emerged from these efforts was called Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, the Jewish Combat Organization, known by its initials OB. It was formed in the autumn of 1942 by a coalition of youth movements and underground groups. Their goal was simple yet audacious: to prepare for armed resistance against the Germans. Mordecai Anielewicz became its commander. Beside him were others: Yitzhak Zuckerman, Zivia Lebetkin, Marek Edelman, names that would later be etched into the memory of defiance. They had no illusions of victory. They knew they could not defeat the German army. What they wanted was to die on their own terms, to choose their fate rather than have it chosen for them. But even as they prepared for death, they created life within their struggle. Meetings were held in basements lit by candles, where plans were whispered over maps. Scouts monitored German movements, tracking patrols and identifying weak points along the walls. Bunkers were built underground, reinforced with stolen bricks and lined with secret tunnels. They hid food, water, medical supplies, everything they would need for the fight to come. Outside the ghetto, the Polish Home Army and the Socialist People's Guard began to recognize the courage of the Jewish fighters. A few Polish officers started supplying explosives. Each weapon smuggled in was a small miracle. A few handguns, some grenades, one rifle. For the first time, the ghetto had teeth. But weapons were not their only strength. Their greatest weapon was resolve. Courage began to spread like a fever. In workshops, laborers sabotaged German orders, ruining uniforms, dulling blades, hiding tools. Couriers carried messages to other ghettos across Poland, spreading word of resistance. The ghetto that the Nazis had intended to break apart was beginning to unite. People who once distrusted each other, Zionists, communists, socialists, religious Jews, now stood on the same side. Ideology no longer mattered. Only defiance did. In January 1943, the first true act of armed resistance took place. The Germans entered the ghetto again to carry out another deportation. This time, they met something they had never expected: fire. As the SS marched through the streets, Jewish fighters opened fire from rooftops and windows. It was chaos, uncoordinated, small in scale, but it changed everything. The Germans, stunned by the resistance, retreated after a few days. For the first time, the Jews of Warsaw had forced the Nazi war machine to pull back. The victory was small, but its impact was immense. Hope returned to a place that had forgotten the meaning of the word. People began to believe that resistance was possible, that even in defeat there could be dignity. The fighters of Obi became legends overnight. The ghetto that had once been filled with silence now hummed with purpose. But resistance came with a terrible price. The Germans responded with brutality. They conducted mass arrests, torturing anyone suspected of helping the underground. Informers were everywhere. The Gestapo's shadow spread through every street. Every knock on the door could mean death. Yet, rather than extinguishing the fire, the terror only fueled it. People who had once hidden in fear now volunteered to join the resistance. They had nothing left to lose. The ghetto's underground press continued to operate. Its writers chronicled every act of courage, every small victory, every moment of defiance. They documented the smuggling networks, the weapon caches, the meetings, the deaths. They knew the odds, but they refused to let the truth die with them. In the pages of those secret newspapers, the tone shifted from despair to determination. "We know we will die," one article declared, "but we will die as free men." Meanwhile, the Germans were preparing their own plans. They had been humiliated by the January skirmish, and they wanted revenge. They studied the ghetto's defenses, mapped its bunkers, and waited for the right moment to strike. But the delay worked in the fighters' favor. It gave them time, precious weeks, to gather more weapons, to dig deeper tunnels, to fortify their positions. They trained by night, rehearsing ambushes, setting traps, memorizing escape routes. The ghetto, once a cage, was transforming into a fortress. Mordecai Anielewicz understood that morale was as important as bullets. He visited every unit personally, speaking to his fighters, reminding them why they fought. "We're the first to fight," he said, "not the last." His words carried through the ghetto, whispered from mouth to mouth, a new kind of prayer for a people who had forgotten how to pray. He believed that their struggle would be remembered, even if they were not. The months leading up to the uprising were filled with tension and anticipation. Every sound in the night could mean the beginning of the end. Children carried messages through the sewer tunnels, their small hands clutching scraps of paper more valuable than gold. Women served as couriers, smuggling weapons beneath their clothes. Doctors stockpiled bandages, alcohol, and morphine. The underground schools became training centers, teaching not math or history, but how to aim, how to reload, how to survive. Yet, even amid the preparation, life went on. Couples married in secret. Parents told their children stories about Jerusalem and freedom. Artists painted murals on cellar walls, depicting suns and rivers and the open sky. These small acts of life were not separate from resistance. They were part of it. To live fully, even for a moment, was to defy the system built to erase them. Outside the walls, the world still turned. Allied planes flew over Europe. The Red Army advanced slowly from the east. News trickled in of battles far away, of German defeats, of cracks appearing in the Nazi Empire. The fighters knew they could not rely on rescue, but the thought of Germany's decline gave them strength. They began to believe that their struggle was not only for themselves, but for history, to show the world that even the condemned could rise. By early April 1943, German preparations were complete. The final liquidation of the ghetto was ordered. The Jews of Warsaw were to be deported once and for all. But this time, when the SS entered, they would not find a frightened population waiting at the trains. They would find barricades, ambushes, and flames. The underground signals were ready. The bunkers were stocked. Every fighter knew that death was certain, but they were ready to meet it on their own terms. In those last quiet nights before the uprising, the city seemed to hold its breath. The wind carried the faint sound of gunmetal being oiled, of whispered prayers, of hearts beating in defiance. The ghetto had been born out of starvation and fear, but it was ending in fire and rebellion. The walls that had been built to imprison would soon burn from within. And when they did, the world would finally hear what the starving had been whispering for years. We are still human, and we will not go quietly. The uprising had not yet begun, but its echo had already reached beyond the ghetto walls. It was no longer just a story of Jews and Germans, of victims and killers. It was a story of the human spirit, of courage in the face of annihilation. The people of the Warsaw Ghetto had been starved, beaten, and betrayed, but they had rediscovered something the Nazis could never understand. In the ruins of their prison, they had found freedom, not in escape, but in resistance. And as the final days before the revolt slipped away, the city stood on the edge of transformation. The same streets that had witnessed hunger and death would soon witness battle. The same people who had bowed their heads would soon lift their weapons. The silence that had smothered Warsaw for years was about to break. The whispers of defiance were becoming a roar. The ghetto was ready to fight. Chapter 6. The Great Deportation, 1942. Treblinka awaits. The morning of July 22nd, 1942, began like any other in the ghetto, quiet, uneasy, heavy with the weight of survival. But beneath that uneasy calm, something terrible was unfolding. German trucks rolled through the streets, engines humming like distant thunder. Posters appeared overnight, nailed to walls and lamp posts, written in stark black letters. The orders were simple, almost bureaucratic. All Jewish residents were to report for resettlement to the east. Families were instructed to pack 20 kilograms of belongings, bring identification papers, and assemble near the railway station on Stocky Street. Those who obeyed were promised food, work, and safety. Those who refused would be shot. No one yet knew that these words marked the beginning of the end. The Germans had chosen a perfect disguise for murder: efficiency. SS officers arrived with clipboards and calm voices, directing crowds as if organizing a transport of livestock. The Jewish police, the so-called Ordnungsdienst, were forced to assist. Many believed the deportations were real, that perhaps the workers would be relocated to labor camps. But the illusion was fragile. Within hours, gunfire echoed through the streets, and corpses began to appear at the curbs. Those who resisted were shot on the spot. Those who tried to flee were hunted down. The machinery of extermination had begun to turn, and it would not stop until the ghetto was nearly empty. The Umschlagplatz, the loading area by the railway, became the last station of life. Families waited in the summer heat, clutching bags and children, their faces pale with confusion and fear. German soldiers patrolled the perimeter, barking orders, their rifles glinting in the sun. The air was filled with the sound of crying and the smell of sweat and dust. Every hour, freight cars groaned as they were filled with human beings. 50, sometimes 100 people crammed into a single car. When the doors slammed shut, a silence followed that felt like the closing of a tomb. The trains left several times a day, bound for a place few had ever heard of, Treblinka. Inside the ghetto, chaos spread. The Judenrat received orders to supply 6,000 people per day for deportation. Adam Cherniakow, the council's head, faced an unbearable choice. He pleaded with the Germans to spare orphans, the sick, and the elderly. They refused. When he was ordered to prepare lists of names for transport, he went back to his office, opened his diary one last time, and wrote, "They demand the death of children. I cannot do it." That evening, he swallowed a cyanide pill. His death was both protest and surrender, the last act of a man crushed by impossible responsibility. After his suicide, the Germans tightened their grip. The Jewish police, under threat of death, carried out roundups with increasing brutality. They stormed buildings, dragging people from their homes. Mothers clutched babies as soldiers tore them away. Old men were beaten for moving too slowly. The streets became rivers of people, pushed toward the assembly points. Every day, more trains departed. Every night, more houses stood empty. Those who hid were hunted like animals. Dogs were brought in to sniff out the living. Children hiding in basements were found by their breathing. Rumors began to spread. People whispered about what was happening at Treblinka. Some said it was a labor camp. Others said it was a place of death. Then came the first witnesses, escapees who had jumped from the trains. They told stories too monstrous to believe. Gas chambers disguised as showers, pits filled with bodies, smoke rising from burning fields. The truth was so horrific that many refused to accept it. Denial became the last defense of the human mind. People clung to hope because the alternative was madness. But some believed. The underground leaders knew the deportations were not relocation, but extermination. Mordecai Neilwicks and his comrades tried to warn others. They distributed leaflets that said, "Do not go to the trains. They are taking you to your death." Few listened. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear made obedience easier than resistance. When soldiers offered bread at the assembly points, people believed it was a sign of mercy. They did not realize it was part of the deception. The Germans had mastered the art of psychological warfare, killing the spirit before killing the body. By the end of the first week, more than 60,000 people had been deported. The ghetto was turning into a graveyard of silence. Windows were smashed, apartments looted, streets littered with torn clothes and abandoned toys. Every day, the same pattern repeated. Gunfire in the morning, trains in the afternoon, silence at night. The smell of fear hung in the air like smoke. The Germans moved with mechanical precision. Each operation was timed, documented, recorded. They were exterminating a city as if conducting an audit. The deportations continued through August, relentless and methodical. Families who had survived the first selections were caught in the next. Entire orphanages were emptied. Dr. Janusz Korczak, the beloved educator, refused to abandon the children under his care. When offered freedom by a German officer, he shook his head. "You do not leave children alone in dark times," he said. On August 5th, he led 200 orphans through the streets toward the Umschlagplatz, each child carrying a small bag, some singing softly to keep from crying. Witnesses recalled the haunting silence that followed after the group disappeared into the trains. None of them were ever seen again. As the weeks dragged on, the ghetto's population shrank from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands. Those who remained faced a grim, new reality. The Germans began clearing entire blocks, setting buildings on fire to drive out anyone in hiding. The sound of collapsing walls became part of the daily rhythm. The streets were lined with corpses. Even the German soldiers grew uneasy. Some complained about the stench. Others, drunk on power, found pleasure in the chaos. For the victims, time had lost meaning. Days and nights blurred together in an endless procession toward death. Amid the despair, acts of quiet heroism continued. Couriers smuggled information to the Polish resistance. Doctors risked their lives to hide patients in hospitals. Parents hid children with Polish families on the other side of the wall. Some Polish neighbors opened their doors. Others slammed them shut. Each act of kindness was a rebellion against the system of hate. But for most, escape was impossible. The walls were too high, the guards too many, the hunger too great. By September, the deportations were slowing. The Germans announced that the resettlement operation was complete. In truth, it had been devastatingly successful. Over 260,000 Jews from Warsaw, men, women, and children, had been sent to Treblinka. Fewer than 10,000 would survive the war. Inside the ghetto, only about 60,000 remained, most of them selected for labor. The rest had vanished into the smoke of the death camp. Those who remained walked through a city of ghosts. Streets once filled with noise were now eerily quiet. Buildings stood empty, their walls blackened by fire. The ghetto had been reduced to ruins and ash. And yet, amid the rubble, a new emotion began to take hold: rage. The survivors understood now that the Germans would never stop, that every act of obedience only delayed the inevitable. The time for illusions was over. The time for resistance had come. The remnants of the underground gathered again. The OB reorganized, joined by another group, the ZW, the Jewish Military Union. They met in secret bunkers, exchanging intelligence and weapons. The reports from Treblinka had left no doubt. They knew that death awaited them, but they refused to meet it kneeling. If we are to die, Anilwick said, let us die fighting, not like sheep led to slaughter. His words carried through the ghetto, igniting something powerful in those who had survived the unthinkable. The Germans, unaware of the scale of the resistance taking shape, turned their attention to other cities. But Warsaw was no longer what it had been. The people left inside were no longer starving victims. They were witnesses turned warriors. The deportations had broken their bodies but sharpened their resolve. The children who had once smuggled bread now smuggled bullets. The same tunnels that had carried food would soon carry weapons. Every wall, every cellar, every rooftop was being prepared for battle. The deportations had changed everything. They had stripped away fear, leaving only fury. For every family torn apart, for every child lost on the trains, for every whisper that went unanswered, the survivors vowed to make the Germans pay. They could not save the millions who had already died, but they could make their deaths mean something. The ghetto that had once been built for imprisonment was now becoming a fortress of defiance. Outside the walls, the trains to Treblinka continued. Smoke from the cremation pits rose over the Polish countryside, darkening the horizon. The world still did not intervene. But inside Warsaw, a storm was gathering. The hunger that had once drained life from the people had been replaced by a new fire, a hunger for justice, for revenge, for meaning. The Great Deportation had ended, but it had left behind something the Germans could not destroy: the will to fight back. As autumn turned to winter, the ghetto fell into an eerie stillness. The snow covered the ruins, softening the scars but not the memory. The survivors moved through the streets like ghosts, carrying the knowledge of what had happened. They could hear the echoes of the trains in their dreams, the voices of those who had gone before them. The deportations had emptied the ghetto of life, but they had filled the hearts of the living with defiance. When the Germans returned months later to finish the job, they would find a city waiting for them, not with fear, but with fire. The Great Deportation had been the darkest chapter of the Warsaw Ghetto's story, but from its ashes, the first true rebellion of the Holocaust was about to rise. The people who had been herded like cattle to the trains were gone. Those who remained were no longer prisoners. They were soldiers of memory, ready to fight for the right to exist, if only for one last day. The walls that had once sealed their fate now held their secret. Beneath the frozen streets, in bunkers and basements, weapons were hidden, plans were whispered, and courage was reborn. The trains to Treblinka still roared in the distance, but soon, the sound of gunfire would answer them. The Great Deportation had ended in silence, but its echo would ignite a war that even the Nazis could not imagine. The ghetto that had once been a place of despair was about to become a legend. The ashes of the dead would become the spark of rebellion. And in the shadow of Treblinka, the Warsaw Ghetto prepared to rise. Chapter 7. The Turning Point. From Fear to Fury. The air inside the Warsaw Ghetto in the winter of 1942 was heavy and cold, but beneath that frost something fierce had begun to stir. For months after the Great Deportation, the streets had been nearly empty, the silence of death pressing down like a weight. Those who had survived walked like shadows through the ruins of what once had been their world. The smell of burnt wood and decay lingered, a reminder of everything that had been lost. But amid that desolation, a new understanding had begun to take hold. The people left behind were not survivors by luck, they were witnesses, and with witnessing came a new responsibility. They now knew what the trains meant. They knew what Treblinka was. And with that knowledge, fear began to crumble, replaced by something sharper, colder, and stronger than despair. Fury. The Germans believed the ghetto was finished. After deporting over 260,000 Jews, they left behind only those deemed useful: workers, tailors, craftsmen, and a few thousand their machinery could exploit. They assumed the remnants would simply fade away, broken and submissive. But what they failed to see was that in emptying the ghetto of its families, they had removed the greatest restraint on rebellion. The people who remained had nothing left to lose. Their parents, their children, their homes, all gone. What remained was a hunger not for food, but for retribution. Mordecai Anielewicz understood this better than anyone. The young leader had survived the Great Deportation by hiding in cellars and moving constantly. Each day, he saw new atrocities, new arrests, new bodies in the streets. But he also saw something else: the slow transformation of a people who had spent years in silence. He wrote in his letters that fear was no longer the master of the ghetto. "There is no return," he said. "We must not wait for death. We must fight it." He began to move from house to house, meeting the remnants of youth groups, uniting them into one cause. These meetings were held in darkness, lit only by candles, the flames flickering against faces hardened by grief. They no longer spoke of survival. They spoke of revenge. The OB, the Jewish Combat Organization, which had been a fragile network of smuggling and underground press, began to transform into something far more dangerous. Weapons were smuggled in from the Polish underground, often at impossible risk. Every gun, every grenade, every bullet was precious. They hid them beneath the floors, inside water barrels, under piles of rags. Couriers, mostly young women who could move more freely, carried messages and money beyond the walls, connecting the ghetto with the Polish resistance on the outside. Each delivery was a gamble with death. Yet the flow of weapons, slow and uneven as it was, gave the ghetto something it hadn't had since the war began: a sense of control. The Germans could starve them, burn their homes, and deport their families. But they could not stop an idea once it had taken root. The idea was simple and terrible: that to die fighting was the only way left to live with dignity. And so, in the cellars beneath the ruins of Warsaw, men and women who had once been teachers, students, tailors, and shopkeepers became soldiers. They trained with mock weapons, rehearsed ambushes, studied German patrol routes. They prepared themselves for a war they knew they could not win. By late 1942, word of the massacres in other ghettos reached Warsaw. Lublin, Krakow, Białystok, all were being liquidated. Each report added fuel to the fire. The Germans were running out of lies. They no longer spoke of resettlement. They gave no explanations, only orders. Every disappearance was a confirmation of what everyone now understood. Extermination was not a rumor. It was policy. The ghetto was not a place of containment. It was a waiting room for death. That winter, the OB decided to act. Not with open warfare yet, but with warnings. They began executing collaborators, informers who betrayed hiding places to the Germans. The message was clear: the ghetto would no longer police itself for the occupiers. For the first time, the balance of fear shifted. Even the Germans sensed it. Patrols began moving more cautiously, rifles always raised, fingers tighter on triggers. The quiet, obedient ghetto they thought they controlled had turned unpredictable. In the underground meetings, Anilwix and his fellow commanders debated strategy. Some argued that armed resistance was suicidal, that it would provoke the Germans into total destruction. Others said that destruction was inevitable regardless. If we die without fighting, one of them said, the world will think we went willingly. But if we fight, even for a moment, they will know the truth. The decision was unanimous. They would prepare for war. The ghetto's surviving craftsmen turned their workshops into weapon factories. They made Molotov cocktails from bottles and gasoline stolen from German vehicles. They sharpened knives, sawed metal pipes into makeshift rifles, forged crude explosives using fertilizer and stolen chemicals. The children became scouts, slipping through cracks in the walls to gather information on German positions. Even the elderly contributed, sewing uniforms or carrying messages. Resistance was no longer just an act of violence. It was a way of life. Then came January 1943. The Germans returned. Their orders were to deport the remaining Jews, those who had escaped the summer transports. But this time, they were met with something they had not expected. As the SS troops advanced down Zamenhof Street, a group of OB fighters opened fire from windows and rooftops. The battle was small, chaotic, and over in hours, but its impact was seismic. The Germans retreated in confusion. They had come expecting submission. Instead, they had been met with bullets. For the first time since the occupation began, Jewish blood was spilled not only as a victim's offering, but in resistance. The ghetto erupted in a quiet celebration, not of joy, but of vindication. For years, they had lived on their knees. In a few moments of gunfire, they had stood upright. News of the skirmish spread beyond the walls. The Polish underground took notice. Across occupied Europe, whispers of Jewish fighters reached partisans and soldiers who had long thought the ghettos were only graves. The world had seen so many victims. Now it saw defiance. The Germans, humiliated, withdrew temporarily to reassess. The lull that followed was brief, but transformative. The fighters used it to strengthen their positions, expand their bunkers, and prepare for the inevitable return. They knew the next German assault would be massive, merciless, and final. But the January resistance had given them something more valuable than weapons. It had given them belief. Belief that courage could cut through despair, that even the most doomed stand could matter. In the months that followed, the ghetto's transformation accelerated. Hidden beneath the streets, tunnels were dug and reinforced. Bunkers were linked by corridors that allowed movement without detection. Weapons were distributed across districts. The OB divided the city into combat zones, each commanded by a small unit. Every fighter took an oath to never surrender, to never board a train, to die on their own terms. They rehearsed endlessly, every movement planned, every route memorized. The Germans called this period the quiet phase. They thought the ghetto had finally accepted its fate. In reality, it was the calm before an explosion. The streets above were empty, but below, the heartbeat of resistance grew stronger. Fighters trained in secret, while outside the walls the Polish resistance smuggled in what little it could: guns, explosives, intelligence. Each act of help was dangerous. The Germans executed anyone caught aiding Jews. But still help came. Humanity, though scarred, had not vanished completely. Mordecai Anilwix spent those months moving from bunker to bunker, rallying his comrades. His speeches were not grand or poetic. They were simple and raw. "We are all already dead," he told them, "but let us die as free men. Let us show the world that our lives had meaning." He reminded them that their fight was not only for themselves, but for history, for the millions who could no longer fight. Every time he spoke, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He was young, barely 24, yet he carried the weight of generations on his shoulders. Life in the ghetto continued in strange parallel to the preparation for death. People still cooked what little food they had, still gathered in secret to pray or sing. Weddings were held underground, with candles and whispered vows. Babies were born in bunkers. Even as death loomed closer, life refused to stop. In those small moments, the fighters found strength. They were not fighting for abstractions like revenge or glory. They were fighting for these fragments of humanity, the laughter of a child, the touch of a hand, the sound of song. By the spring of 1943, everything was ready. The bunkers were stocked, the ammunition distributed, the escape routes mapped. The Germans were expected to strike any day. Scouts reported unusual movements outside the walls, convoys of trucks, columns of soldiers, supplies being stockpiled. The fighters braced themselves. Each day could be the last, but no one flinched. The fear that had once ruled the ghetto was gone. What replaced it was a fierce, unyielding calm. The people who had once bowed their heads now looked at the sky differently. They no longer watched for mercy, but for fire. They no longer prayed for life, but for vengeance. The deportations had taken their families. The starvation had taken their bodies. Now they would give back what little they had left, their defiance. For months, they had watched the Germans destroy their world piece by piece. Now, they would destroy the illusion of German invincibility. When April arrived, the city held its breath. The walls of the ghetto stood like tombstones, but behind them was something the Germans could not yet see: a people reborn through loss. The turning point had come quietly, without fanfare or ceremony. It came in the form of resolve, in the silence between breaths, in the glint of a pistol hidden under a coat. It came in the whispered words passed from one fighter to another: "We will not go to Treblinka." The Germans had always believed they could control everything: fear, hunger, obedience. But they could not control what happens when fear dies. They could not control fury. The ghetto was no longer the place they had built to contain life. It had become a crucible, ready to unleash death in return. Every survivor had become a weapon, every street a potential trap, every heartbeat a countdown to revolt. The transformation was complete. The Warsaw Ghetto, once a symbol of submission, was now a fortress of rebellion. Its fighters did not expect victory. They expected to burn. But they also knew that in their fire, others might one day find light. The turning point had arrived, not in the sound of an explosion, but in the silence of decision. The silence before the first shot, when a people who had been condemned to die chose instead to fight. And when the Germans returned on that April morning to finish what they had started, they would find not victims waiting for trains, but warriors waiting for them. The ghetto's long night of fear was over. The dawn of fury had come. Chapter 8. The Gathering Storm, Preparing for the Fight. By the beginning of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto was no longer the prison the Nazis believed it to be. It was a volcano waiting to erupt. Beneath its broken streets and crumbling walls, men and women labored in secret, turning despair into defiance. Every bunker that had once been a hiding place was now a fortress. Every smuggled bullet was a spark waiting to ignite. The survivors of the Great Deportation had spent months transforming themselves from victims into soldiers, preparing for a fight they knew they could not win, but could no longer refuse. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about dignity, vengeance, and history. They would not let their people vanish quietly into the smoke of Treblinka. The ghetto, once bursting with hundreds of thousands of souls, had shrunk to roughly 50,000. These were the remnants, the strong, the lucky, and the defiant. They worked in German factories by day, sewing uniforms, repairing boots, mending the machinery of the enemy's war. But by night, the same hands that stitched German coats built barricades, forged weapons, and planned rebellion. The night was their ally, the shadows their camouflage. Meetings were held in the basements of ruined buildings, lit by flickering candles, maps spread across wooden tables. Whispered voices spoke not of hunger or despair, but of ammunition, escape routes, and ambush points. The language of survival had changed. Mordecai and Neelwix moved through this underground world like a phantom, tireless, calm, and utterly determined. He knew the Germans would come again. The January skirmish had proven that resistance was possible, but also that it would invite retaliation. Since then, he had been preparing for the inevitable. He met with his commanders every night, discussing the same questions over and over. How long could they hold out? How much could they hurt the enemy before they fell? Could they inspire others to rise after they were gone? These were not the plans of men who hoped to live. They were the blueprints of those who had accepted death but refused defeat. The ghetto's resistance was divided into two main forces. The OB, the Jewish Combat Organization, made up mostly of leftist and Zionist youth groups, and the ZW, the Jewish Military Union, composed of former soldiers, nationalists, and right-wing Zionists. For years, these groups had disagreed about politics, ideology, and the future of the Jewish people. Now, ideology no longer mattered. They shared the same enemy and the same fate. Slowly, through careful negotiation and mutual respect, they began to cooperate. It was an uneasy alliance, born not of trust but necessity. Together, they began to coordinate patrols, share information, and distribute weapons. Weapons, however, were still almost impossible to find. The Germans had made sure of that. Every firearm, every grenade had to be smuggled in from the Polish underground outside the ghetto walls. Couriers risked their lives carrying pistols hidden in loaves of bread, ammunition packed inside coal sacks, grenades wrapped in blankets disguised as laundry. A single gun could cost the equivalent of several months of food rations. The fighters collected money from those who still had valuables, wedding rings, silver spoons, family heirlooms, and used it to buy weapons. Every transaction was an act of faith, a belief that when the time came, even one bullet could make a difference. The Polish Home Army, the Army of Krajowa, provided limited assistance. Their own situation was precarious, and anti-Semitism within their ranks made cooperation difficult. Still, there were brave Poles who defied orders and helped. Members of the Communist People's Guard also smuggled weapons and shared intelligence. Each act of aid was small, but in the ghetto, small acts meant survival. Every bullet that crossed the wall carried with it a message: you are not forgotten. Inside the ghetto, the preparation continued relentlessly. The fighters built bunkers beneath the ruins, underground chambers connected by narrow tunnels, designed to shelter civilians during bombardment and serve as command posts during battle. Some were large enough to hold dozens of people, stocked with food, water, and makeshift ventilation systems. Others were so small that only a handful could fit. They hid weapons, documents, and medical supplies inside walls and under floorboards. Maps of the sewers were drawn and memorized. The city beneath the city was coming alive, a secret labyrinth of resistance. The fighters trained with what little they had. They practiced with wooden rifles, rehearsing the motions of aiming and firing. They learned how to throw Molotov cocktails, how to dismantle German weapons, how to move silently through dark corridors. Women served as scouts and couriers, their courage equal to any man's. Many were teenagers, yet they carried messages through sewer tunnels and bribed guards with cigarettes and food. They were the veins of the underground movement, carrying lifeblood between its organs. Anil Wicks was everywhere. He met with unit leaders, inspected bunkers, wrote letters, and trained new recruits. His words became the heartbeat of the resistance. "We are not fighting for our lives," he told them. "We are fighting so that the world will know that we lived." His presence inspired those around him. He was not a general commanding soldiers. He was a man among the doomed, carrying the same fear, but choosing to rise above it. Those who met him remembered his quiet intensity, the fire in his eyes, and the calm in his voice. The resistance had few illusions. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. They had seen the power of the German army, the tanks, the flamethrowers, the machine guns. They knew that when the final liquidation began, the Germans would come with everything they had. But they had something the Germans could not comprehend: purpose. They had lived through starvation, disease, and betrayal. They had nothing left but the will to fight, and that made them dangerous. In February, scouts began to notice changes outside the walls. German patrols were increasing. Soldiers were inspecting the gates more frequently. Rumors circulated that Heinrich Himmler himself had ordered the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto to coincide with Hitler's birthday in April. The fighters knew what that meant. The Germans would come soon, in overwhelming numbers, and they would destroy everything in their path. But the people of the ghetto had made their choice. They would not be taken again. The months before the uprising were a blur of activity. Resistance units mapped the streets, designating choke points and ambush sites. They identified buildings to use as sniper positions and stockpiled bottles for Molotov cocktails. The Germans would expect fear and chaos. They would find coordination and discipline. Civilians were instructed to build hiding places, to dig escape tunnels, to prepare for fire and destruction. Every man, woman, and child understood their role. The ghetto had become an army. There was no pretense of victory. Everyone knew how it would end. They had seen what happened to the ghettos in other cities. But what mattered now was the message. To the Germans, to the Poles, to the world beyond the barbed wire. They would show that Jews had not gone quietly to their deaths. They would show that dignity could exist even in annihilation. The German spies inside the ghetto reported strange things. They noted the unusual calm, the absence of panic. They mentioned that patrols were being watched, that buildings seemed to have eyes. They did not understand what they were seeing. To them, the Jews were supposed to be broken, obedient, and defeated. The idea of an organized rebellion was unthinkable. It was a fatal blindness born of arrogance. Meanwhile, life continued in the ghetto in strange harmony with death. Musicians played in underground rooms. Teachers continued lessons in secret schools. Lovers met in the shadows, whispering promises they both knew would never be kept. In the midst of planning for destruction, people clung fiercely to fragments of normal life. It was not denial, it was defiance. To live, even for a day, was to resist the fate the Germans had planned. Anil Wicks wrote one final letter to his friends outside the ghetto. "The dream of my life is being realized," he wrote. "I have lived to see Jewish defense in the ghetto in all its greatness and glory." His words were not those of a man facing death with sorrow, but with pride. He knew that what they were about to do would echo beyond Warsaw, beyond the war itself. History would remember not how they died, but why. By early April, all preparations were complete. The Germans would come at dawn, as they always did, expecting submission. Instead, they would be met with fire. The fighters knew the timing was close. The signs were unmistakable. Columns of SS troops were gathering outside the walls. Tanks were being positioned. The smell of gasoline hung in the air. The world above seemed to hold its breath. In the final days before the uprising, the atmosphere inside the ghetto was almost serene. People went about their routines with a strange calm, as if the fear had burned itself out. There were no more illusions left, no more desperate hopes for rescue. They had accepted their fate, but on their own terms. Parents held their children close, whispering lullabies not to comfort them, but to make sure their last memories were of love, not terror. Fighters checked their weapons, polished their rifles, and shared quiet meals in the candlelight. The night before the Germans came, the ghetto was unnaturally still. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The wind rattled broken shutters. In one bunker, a group of young fighters sat together in silence. One of them began to hum a song, a pre-war tune about freedom and home. Slowly, others joined in, their voices soft, almost fragile. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped turning. Outside the walls, the German troops were assembling. SS units, police battalions, and Ukrainian auxiliaries waited for orders. Their commanders spoke of efficiency, of liquidation, of cleansing. They had no idea that they were about to walk into an inferno of defiance. Inside the ghetto, the fighters waited, hands trembling over triggers, hearts steady. When dawn came, the sun rose blood-red over Warsaw, its light filtering through smoke and dust. The sound of engines roared to life. German trucks rumbled forward. Soldiers shouted, boots pounding against cobblestones. And then, just as the first units reached the ghetto gates, a single shot rang out. It was the sound that broke years of silence. It was the beginning of something the Germans could never have imagined. But in that last quiet moment before chaos, before flames and blood and gunfire, the ghetto stood united. Not as prisoners, but as warriors. They had prepared for months, for years, for this single moment of truth. The walls that had once caged them were now their battlements. The ruins were their kingdom. The ghetto was ready. The storm had gathered, and its thunder was about to shake the world. Chapter 9. The Spark, January 1943 Skirmish. The morning of January 18th, 1943, began like so many others under German occupation, gray, cold, and silent. But within hours, the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto would erupt in chaos, and history itself would shift. What began that day as another German deportation became something entirely different, something the Nazis had never expected, a fight. It was the moment when the final illusion of obedience was shattered, when the hunted turned on the hunter. For years, the Jews of Warsaw had been starved, beaten, and murdered. They had watched their families vanish into the trains bound for Treblinka. But on that winter morning, when the Germans came again to finish what they had started, they were met with fire. In the weeks before, the ghetto had been eerily calm. The Germans had reduced it to a shell of its former self. Tens of thousands gone, streets half empty, windows boarded up, walls cracked from bombardment. The survivors who remained were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and hungry, but they were no longer afraid. The fear had burned away, leaving behind a cold, determined rage. The OB, the Jewish Combat Organization, had spent months preparing for this moment. Their weapons were few: pistols, homemade bombs, and a handful of rifles, but their will was stronger than steel. They knew that this time, when the Germans came, they would not be taken alive. At dawn, German trucks rolled into the ghetto. Columns of SS troops, flanked by Ukrainian and Latvian auxiliaries, moved through the streets with their usual arrogance. Loudspeakers blared orders. All Jews were to assemble for labor transport. But no one moved. The people had heard those words before. They knew what transport meant. They had seen the empty faces of those who had gone and never returned. Behind shuttered windows, hands gripped weapons. In hidden bunkers, young men and women whispered prayers, not for safety, but for courage. The first shots came without warning. As the Germans entered a building on Zamenhof Street to begin rounding up workers, gunfire exploded from the stairwell. For young fighters, disguised among those waiting for deportation, drew pistols and opened fire at point-blank range. The sound was deafening in the narrow corridor, bullets slamming into uniforms, glass shattering, smoke filling the air. 2 SS officers fell instantly, their bodies tumbling down the stairs. The others fired blindly, their shouts echoing through the building. For the first time in 3 years, the hunters had been ambushed by the hunted. The gunfire spread like lightning. Within minutes, fighting erupted across multiple streets. OB units sprang from hiding, attacking German patrols with pistols, grenades, and homemade explosives. They fought from rooftops, from windows, from the sewers below. German soldiers, trained for organized warfare, were caught off guard by the chaos. The ghetto, which they had long viewed as a cage for helpless victims, had turned into a battlefield. The smoke of gunfire mingled with the winter fog, creating a gray haze through which only the flashes of explosions could be seen. In one corner of the ghetto, a group of fighters led by Mordecai and Neilwicks launched an ambush on a patrol near Mila Street. Their weapons were crude, Molotov cocktails made from bottles of kerosene, wicks cut from old rags, but they burned fiercely. When the first bottle hit a German truck, flames shot into the sky. The sound of cracking glass and the screams of soldiers filled the street. The fighters retreated into the ruins, disappearing before the Germans could regroup. It was not just a tactical victory, it was psychological. The myth of Jewish helplessness had been broken. The Germans responded with fury. Reinforcements poured in, tanks rumbling through the ghetto's narrow streets. Machine guns were mounted on rooftops, and buildings suspected of harboring fighters were set ablaze. Flames consumed the old brick houses, sending black smoke into the sky. But even as the fire spread, the resistance did not stop. Small groups of fighters moved through the chaos like ghosts, striking from hidden alleys, vanishing into tunnels. For the first time, German troops hesitated before entering a building. The ghetto had become a maze of death. Civilians watched from their windows, stunned by what they were witnessing. For years, they had seen only surrender and slaughter. Now they saw defiance. They saw young men and women, some barely old enough to shave, fighting soldiers with rifles and grenades. It gave them something they had not felt in years: pride. Even those who had doubted the resistance now whispered blessings for the fighters. Mothers held their children close and told them to remember what they were seeing. "We are not sheep," they said. "We are people." The battle raged for 4 days. Each hour was a test of endurance. The fighters had no reinforcements, no supplies, no way out. When ammunition ran out, they used knives, clubs, anything they could find. German soldiers dragged prisoners from buildings and shot them in the streets, hoping to break the spirit of the ghetto. But the opposite happened. Every death seemed to fuel the fire. The more the Germans killed, the more fiercely the survivors fought. Annihilation himself was in the thick of it. He moved between positions, shouting orders, encouraging the young fighters who looked to him for strength. His presence steadied them. They called him the commander, but he fought like any other, running through smoke, throwing grenades, pulling wounded comrades to safety. In his notebook, found later after his death, he wrote about those 4 days with pride and sorrow. "It is the first time in the history of the ghetto," he wrote, "that we resisted with arms. We did not want to die without fighting." By the 4th day, the Germans realized they could not continue the operation without sustaining unacceptable losses. They pulled back, temporarily halting deportations. It was a retreat, small by military standards, but monumental in spirit. The Jews of Warsaw had forced the most powerful army in Europe to withdraw. The price was heavy. Hundreds were dead, buildings destroyed, but the victory was undeniable. For the first time, the ghetto had won. After the battle, the ghetto was eerily quiet again. The streets were littered with bodies and debris, the walls blackened by fire. Smoke hung in the air for days. But beneath the devastation was something new: belief. The fighters, though exhausted and mourning their dead, had proven that resistance was possible. They had shown that even in the heart of darkness, a spark of courage could ignite a blaze. The people began to look at each other differently. They were no longer prisoners. They were soldiers waiting for the next fight. The Germans were furious. The SS commander in Warsaw, Ferdinand von Samron-Franknegg, was humiliated. He ordered reprisals, mass executions, and the destruction of entire sections of the ghetto. But the damage was done, not to the Jews, but to the illusion of Nazi control. Reports of the fighting spread through occupied Poland, then beyond. In the forests, partisans whispered of the Jewish fighters of Warsaw. In other ghettos, resistance cells took heart, vowing to rise when their time came. Even in Treblinka, prisoners who had escaped spoke of the gunfire they had heard from afar, the sound of rebellion echoing through the silence of death. Inside the ghetto, the resistance began to rebuild. The fighters salvaged what they could from the wreckage: weapons, ammunition, medical supplies. They fortified the bunkers, deepened the tunnels, and prepared for the inevitable German return. They knew the next battle would be larger, bloodier, final. But they also knew something had changed forever. They had shown that courage was still possible, even when survival was not. The civilians who remained now looked to the fighters with reverence. They brought them food, carried messages, and helped hide weapons. The ghetto had become a community, united by defiance. Even those who had once doubted the wisdom of resistance began to understand. Death was coming either way. The choice was no longer whether to die, but how. And now, for the first time, they could choose to die standing. In February, the German command replaced Samron-Franknegg with Jürgen Stroop, an officer known for his ruthlessness. Himmler himself had been enraged by the January skirmish. He ordered that the next liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto be total, that not a single building be left standing. Stroop promised to deliver it, but he underestimated what the Jews had become. He saw only ruins, starving workers, and broken streets. He did not see the network of bunkers, the maps of the tunnels, the stockpiles of explosives. He did not see the fire that burned behind the hollow eyes of the survivors. The January revolt had lasted 4 days, but its echo spread far beyond those streets. It reached the forests of Belarus, where Jewish partisans were fighting the Germans. It reached other ghettos, Białystok, Vilna, Krakow, where whispers of the uprising inspired others to prepare their own. It reached even the Allied capitals, where reports filtered through the underground press. For the first time, the world heard of Jews who fought back, who had refused to go quietly to their deaths. For the fighters themselves, the victory was bittersweet. They buried their dead, rebuilt their bunkers, and waited. They knew the Germans would return with greater force, but they also knew they had accomplished something extraordinary. They had taken back their humanity, if only for a moment. They had written the first line of a new chapter in Jewish history, a chapter not of lamentation, but of defiance. That night, after the final shots had faded and the last fires smoldered, a strange calm settled over the ruins. Survivors gathered in the shadows, lighting candles for the dead. The flames flickered against the broken walls, tiny beacons of life in a sea of destruction. Someone began to sing a song, low and trembling at first, then stronger. Others joined in. It was not a song of mourning, but of defiance, a promise whispered into the smoke. We are still here. The Germans had come to erase the last remnants of Warsaw's Jews. Instead, they had awakened a rebellion that would shake the foundations of their empire. The January uprising was not the end. It was the beginning. The ghetto that had once been silent now pulsed with the heartbeat of resistance. The people who had once waited for death were now waiting for battle. The next time the Germans came, they would bring tanks, flamethrowers, and fire. But this time, the ghetto would meet them not with fear, but with fury. The spark had been lit, and nothing could extinguish it now. Chapter 10. April 19th, 1943, the uprising begins. It was dawn on April 19th, 1943, Hitler's birthday. The Germans had chosen this day deliberately, imagining it as a perfect gift to their Führer, the final destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, the symbolic extermination of Jewish resistance. They expected another operation of control and routine, a cleansing of the last remnants. What they did not expect was that when they entered the ghetto that morning, the hunted would no longer cower. The men and women they had planned to deport or burn alive were waiting for them, not in silence, but in ambush. Behind every wall, beneath every ruin, resistance was ready. The long night of fear was over. The day of defiance had come. The first German units entered through the main gate at 6 in the morning. Troops from the SS, Polish police auxiliaries, and Ukrainian guards. They moved in formation, rifles ready, confident from years of conquest. Leading them was SS and police leader Jürgen Stroop, newly assigned to finish the job his predecessor had failed to complete. He was calm, certain that this would take only a few hours. After all, they were facing a few thousand starving Jews. What did they possibly do? But as the first soldiers stepped into the central streets of the ghetto, the trap closed. A grenade exploded from above, sending shards of metal through the column. Machine gun fire erupted from the windows. The air filled with dust and screams. Within minutes, the order and precision of the German army dissolved into panic. From rooftops and attics, Jewish fighters rained bullets and homemade bombs down on the invaders. Molotov cocktails shattered against tanks, setting them ablaze. The fire spread to nearby buildings, black smoke curling into the pale morning sky. German soldiers dove for cover behind walls that no longer stood. The ghetto, which had seemed a graveyard for so long, now roared with life. Resistance banners appeared on the rooftops, a white and blue Jewish flag alongside the red and white of Poland. They fluttered defiantly over the ruins as if to announce that freedom, for one moment in history, had returned to Warsaw. Mordecai Anielewicz, the commander of the OB, was in his bunker at 18 Mila Street, directing the fight. He listened to the sounds of battle echoing through the labyrinth of streets, the explosions, the gunfire, the shouted commands. For months, he had wondered how it would feel when the fighting began. Now, as the chaos unfolded, he knew. Fear had no place left to live. They were fighting not for victory, but for meaning. "This is it," he whispered to his comrades. "The world will hear of us today." The Germans regrouped quickly, bringing in reinforcements, armored cars, flamethrowers, and heavy artillery. But the fighters knew the terrain better than anyone. They struck in small units, appearing from cellars, firing, and disappearing into the maze of alleys. When the Germans tried to advance down one street, they found barricades of rubble and barbed wire waiting for them. When they cleared one building, gunfire erupted from another. The ghetto had become a living trap, every corner a snare. The fighters moved like shadows, coordinated through messengers who darted through tunnels connecting the bunkers. Communication was frantic but effective. For hours, the German advance stalled. As the morning turned to afternoon, the battle spread. Flames consumed the wooden structures that had survived the earlier deportations. The air was thick with smoke and gunpowder. From time to time, the wind shifted, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning rubber and human sweat. Civilians huddled in basements, praying as the walls trembled. Many of them had chosen to stay underground, ready to die in their hiding places rather than surrender. The fighters above knew that the Germans would soon bring their full fury down upon them. But they also knew something extraordinary had happened. The impossible had occurred. The German war machine, the symbol of total domination, had been stopped, even if only for a day. By evening, Stroop's men were in disarray. Reports of casualties came in from every sector. Snipers from the ZW fired from the rooftops of Miranowska Street, their bullets striking officers who tried to rally their troops. Explosions echoed from courtyards as fighters threw grenades into German positions. Stroop ordered tanks forward to crush the resistance, but the narrow streets worked against him. The tanks could not maneuver. Several were destroyed by Molotov cocktails. Their crews burned alive inside. The heat from the flames lit the night like a second dawn. The Germans, frustrated and enraged, pulled back to regroup. The first day of what they had expected to be a brief operation had turned into humiliation. Inside the bunkers, the fighters gathered by candlelight. They had lost comrades, dozens killed, hundreds wounded, but their spirits were unbroken. Anielewicz wrote in his diary that night, describing the pride that filled his heart. "The dream of my life has come true," he wrote. "I have seen Jewish self-defense in all its grandeur and glory." Around him, the others cleaned their weapons, patched wounds, and whispered to one another. There was no talk of surrender. They knew what awaited them if they were captured. They would fight to the last bullet, and when that was gone, they would fight with fire and knives in their bare hands. At dawn on April 20th, the Germans returned with fury. This time, Stroop brought tanks and flamethrowers in large numbers. He ordered his men to burn the ghetto building by building, to smoke out the fighters from their hiding places. The SS moved systematically, setting fire to entire blocks, their faces lit by the infernal glow. The roar of flames filled the air, the sound so loud it drowned out even the gunfire. The smell of burning wood and flesh became one. Yet even as the fire spread, the resistance did not collapse. The fighters moved underground, using the network of tunnels to strike where the Germans least expected. Stroop's frustration grew. His men, trained for open combat, were terrified of the narrow corridors and sudden ambushes. Reports of German soldiers refusing to enter the ghetto circulated among the ranks. Stroop wrote in his daily report, "The Jews and bandits resisted in every building and in every street." His words, intended as justification for his brutality, would one day serve as testimony to the courage of those he called bandits. By the third day, The ghetto had become an inferno. The Germans had begun using artillery and aerial bombardment to level entire sections. Buildings collapsed, burying fighters and civilians alike. The sky above Warsaw turned black with smoke. But the flames only revealed the strength of the underground network. Bunkers hidden beneath the rubble continued to resist. The fighters emerged from unexpected places, striking and vanishing again. Stroop's men nicknamed them the Rats, but they fought like lions. In one of the fiercest battles, fighters from the ZW raised their flag once again on Muranoski Square. German officers ordered it torn down, but every time it fell, another fighter climbed the ruins to raise it again. It was more than a symbol. It was a message. For the first time in Europe's darkest hour, the world could see that Jewish resistance was real, defiant, and alive. The fighting raged for days, each one more brutal than the last. German flamethrowers turned entire tenements into torches. Civilians trapped in basements suffocated from smoke. The fighters, choking and blinded, continued to fire until the heat forced them underground. The bunkers became tombs. In some, families huddled together, holding hands as the air grew thinner. In others, wounded fighters shared their last drops of water before collapsing. The ghetto was dying, but it was dying on its own terms. By the end of the first week, Stroop changed tactics. He ordered the systematic destruction of the entire ghetto. Building by building, street by street, his troops planted explosives, blowing up what remained. The sound of detonations rolled across Warsaw like thunder. From the other side of the wall, Polish civilians watched in horror as flames consumed the district. The sky glowed orange for nights on end, the fire so bright it could be seen for miles. But even as the ghetto burned, gunfire continued. The Jews of Warsaw had made a promise to die fighting, and they were keeping it. Mordecai and Neil Wick's last letter, written during those final days, carried the voice of a man who had already transcended fear. "What we have done is beyond belief," he wrote. "We fought the Germans for 3 days, and even 4. We will continue as long as we have weapons." His handwriting was steady, his words defiant. He knew they were doomed, but he also knew they had won something greater than life. They had restored the dignity of a people the world had tried to erase. By April 27th, most of the organized resistance had been crushed, but small pockets continued to fight. Stroop's troops flooded the sewers with gas, set explosives to collapse the tunnels, and used loudspeakers to demand surrender. Few answered. The fighters preferred death underground to the trains. They had seen Treblinka in their dreams and chosen fire over smoke. On May 8th, German forces discovered a Neil Wick's command bunker at 18 Mila Street. They surrounded it and launched tear gas grenades inside. Dozens of fighters were trapped. Rather than surrender, Neil Wick and his comrades took their own lives. In his final act, he fulfilled his promise to die as a free man, not as a slave. When the Germans entered the bunker, they found silence. Stroop reported it as a victory, but history would remember it as something else entirely. The end of one of the most heroic acts of resistance in human history. For weeks after, isolated groups continued to fight, refusing to believe it was over. Even as the ghetto lay in ruins, they emerged at night to strike German patrols, their bullets echoing through the ashes. The uprising had no survivors in the traditional sense, but it had left behind something indestructible, an idea. The Jews of Warsaw had fought back. They had proven that even in the face of total annihilation, courage could still exist. On May 16, 1943, Stroop sent his final report to his superiors. It contained a single sentence that he believed captured his triumph. The former Jewish quarter of Warsaw no longer exists. He punctuated it with a photograph of the great synagogue being blown up, the explosion captured in midair. But in truth, it was not the Jews who had been erased that day. It was the illusion of Nazi omnipotence. Stroop's report, intended as a testament to his victory, became a monument to his failure. The world would read it not as proof of destruction, but as evidence of defiance. The Warsaw Ghetto lay in ruins, a wasteland of ash and silence. The smell of smoke lingered for months, the earth itself poisoned by fire. But beneath the rubble, buried in secret caches, were letters, diaries, drawings, and photographs, the records of those who had lived and fought there. The Ringelblum archive survived the war, unearthed years later from milk cans and metal boxes. In those pages, the dead spoke to the living, telling their story not of defeat, but of rebellion. The uprising of April 1943 lasted less than a month, but its echo has lasted generations. It was not a military victory, but it was a moral one. It proved that even when stripped of everything, home, family, food, hope, human beings could still choose defiance. The men and women of the Warsaw Ghetto knew they could not win against the might of the German Reich. Yet they fought anyway, because to them, fighting was living. Every bullet they fired, every fire they set, every banner they raised was a declaration to the world. We existed, we resisted, and we will be remembered. And so, in the heart of Europe's darkness, on a day chosen by Hitler himself, the light of rebellion burned brightest. The Warsaw Ghetto, once the symbol of Jewish suffering, became the symbol of Jewish resistance. It was not a story of how they died, but of how they refused to die quietly. And even as the smoke settled and the city fell silent again, the flame they lit continued to burn, an unending reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, the spirit of freedom could not be extinguished. Chapter 11. The Battle for Every Street. Inferno of Resistance. The uprising had begun as a whisper, a single defiant spark, but by late April 1943, that spark had erupted into an inferno that swallowed the Warsaw Ghetto whole. For weeks, the narrow streets of the district had been transformed into a battleground unlike anything the Germans had imagined. Every corner, every stairwell, every window had become a front line. The Jewish fighters, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with an intensity that defied all logic, turning their ruined city into a fortress built on desperation and courage. The smoke of burning buildings mixed with the smell of gunpowder and flesh. The sky above Warsaw burned day and night, a flickering scar on the horizon. The Germans called it a liquidation. History would remember it as resistance. By the second week of the uprising, the ghetto was no longer a place of civilians and soldiers. It was a single organism fighting for its last breath. The OB and the ZW coordinated their defense through tunnels and rooftops, striking in coordinated bursts of violence and disappearing before the Germans could retaliate. The German soldiers, many of them veterans from the Eastern Front, were stunned. They had been told the ghetto was filled with starving, broken Jews. Instead, they found trained fighters with weapons, strategy, and the will to die standing. Each street was a trap, each corner a lesson in humiliation. On Nowolepy Street, a group of fighters ambushed a German patrol, killing nearly a dozen before vanishing into the ruins. When the Germans returned hours later, they found the corpses of their own comrades strung up as warnings. On Muranowska Street, snipers picked off officers one by one from the windows of burning tenements, their silhouettes vanishing into smoke. The Germans brought tanks, armored cars, and flamethrowers, but the narrow streets worked against them. They could not move without exposing themselves. The ghetto's labyrinth swallowed their formations whole. Stroop's troops advanced only to be met with explosions, gunfire, and silence. The resistance fighters, many of them barely in their 20s, fought with an improvisational genius that came from necessity. They had no supply lines, no reinforcements, no command structure beyond their own determination. They used broken bricks as shields, sewer covers as barricades, and ladders to move across rooftops. Grenades were fashioned from tin cans filled with shrapnel. Bottles filled with gasoline became the most feared weapon in the ghetto. When thrown against the German tanks, they turned steel into fire. For days, the German army, so proud, so mechanized, was forced to retreat from streets that should have been easy to conquer. But victory in the ghetto was not measured in land or numbers. It was measured in hours of survival, in the delay of inevitability. Every minute they fought was a defiance of extinction. The fighters knew that no help would come, that the world beyond the walls was silent. They had no illusions of rescue, only the desire to prove that even in annihilation, the spirit of a people could not be extinguished. Their defiance was both their weapon and their monument. As the days dragged on, Stroop's frustration turned to fury. He had been sent to destroy the ghetto, not to fight a war. Each morning, he ordered more troops, more weapons, more destruction. His reports to Himmler became a litany of blood and fire. When the Germans could not capture a building, they set it ablaze. When they could not root out a bunker, they sealed it and flooded it with gas. When they could not find the fighters, they murdered civilians in their place. It was a scorched earth campaign, a massacre disguised as order. Yet even as the ghetto burned to ashes, resistance continued. The bunkers beneath the ground became the last strongholds. Hidden beneath the rubble, these underground fortresses were miracles of survival, some with electricity, water, even ventilation systems. Families and fighters lived side by side in the dark, the walls trembling from the explosions above. The air was thick and hot, filled with smoke and fear. Still, people whispered prayers, shared food, and listened to the faint sounds of battle echoing through the tunnels. For those trapped below, the war was heard rather than seen. The thud of grenades, the rumble of tanks, the crack of rifles. Every sound was a reminder that they were still alive. In the bunkers, the fighters planned their next moves. Messages were carried by couriers who crawled through narrow passages to reach other units. Communication was slow, but it kept the resistance alive. Anil Wicks and his comrades at 18 Mila Street issued orders, urging fighters to conserve ammunition, to focus on ambushes rather than direct assaults. They knew the end was coming, but they were determined to make the Germans pay for every inch. "If we must die," one fighter wrote, "let it be with their blood on our hands." The Germans began using flamethrowers to flush the resistance out of hiding. Flames roared through basements, consuming air, walls, and people alike. Civilians ran, choking from their shelters, only to be cut down by gunfire. Entire families died holding each other as fire devoured the air around them. The heat was so intense that glass melted, bricks cracked, and metal warped. Stroop's men began to describe the operation as the burning of the Jews. The phrase was meant as a boast, but revealed the scale of their brutality. The ghetto had become a furnace, and its people its unyielding fuel. And still, even then, the fighting did not stop. Resistance fighters emerged from the flames like ghosts, their faces blackened with soot, their clothes torn, their weapons barely functional. They attacked German positions, threw grenades, and vanished again into the inferno. Each act of defiance was a declaration. You can destroy our homes, our bodies, our world, but you cannot destroy our will. It was not war in the traditional sense. It was rebellion in its purest form, a cry against the end of existence itself. The Germans, enraged by the losses, began to destroy the ghetto systematically. They advanced building by building, blowing up entire blocks with dynamite. Stroop's men called it clearing. What they were really doing was erasing a city from the earth. The explosions came one after another, shaking the ground like distant thunder. Smoke blotted out the sun, turning day into an endless dusk. From the other side of the wall, Poles watched helplessly as the sky over Warsaw glowed orange for weeks. Even they could smell the burning, an odor of smoke, oil, and human ash. In the midst of that apocalypse, the fighters refused to give up. In one bunker, a group of ZW soldiers made their last stand with the Polish flag and the blue and white banner of Israel fluttering above them. When German troops approached, they detonated explosives, killing themselves and their attackers together. In another part of the ghetto, two brothers fought until their ammunition ran out, then hurled stones until they were shot down. Each death became a story, each act of resistance a thread in the tapestry of defiance that no bomb could erase. Anil Wick's messages during these days were grim but resolute. The struggle is growing more difficult, he wrote. Our bunkers are being destroyed one by one. Still, the spirit of our fighters is extraordinary. We will not go to the flames quietly. His words, carried through the tunnels, kept the resistance alive even as hope crumbled. He became more than a commander. He became a symbol. His calm determination reminded everyone why they fought. Not for victory, but for the right to die as free human beings. By the final week of April, the ghetto was unrecognizable. Streets once alive with resistance were reduced to rubble. Buildings had collapsed into smoking heaps. The Germans, unable to locate the remaining bunkers, flooded them with gas and water. Civilians suffocated in the dark, clutching each other as the air disappeared. Fighters, cornered and exhausted, took their own lives rather than surrender. The silence that followed each explosion was more haunting than the noise itself. It was the sound of absence, the sound of a people being erased from the world above. Still, in the shadows, there were moments of staggering courage. In one corner of the ghetto, a small group of fighters managed to break through the German lines and escape through the sewers. Crawling for hours through filth and darkness, they emerged outside the walls into the ruins of the Polish city. Many joined the Polish underground, continuing the fight against the Nazis. Others simply vanished, carrying with them the last living memory of the ghetto that once was. By early May, the resistance was shattered. The bunkers had been destroyed, the fighters dead or captured. On May 8th, the Germans discovered a Neelwick's bunker at Mila Street. Surrounded and facing certain death, he and his comrades chose to end their lives together. They gathered in the dim light of the bunker, the air thick with smoke and sorrow. There were no speeches, no last pleas for mercy. They had already made their statement through their actions. When the Germans entered later, they found silence. The uprising was effectively over, but Stroop continued the destruction for days. On May 16th, he ordered the demolition of the Great Synagogue of Warsaw. As the building exploded in a cloud of dust and fire, Stroop stood watching, satisfied. The Jewish quarter of Warsaw no longer exists, he wrote in his final report. He believed he had erased a people, but what he had really done was immortalize them. His own report, filled with photographs and meticulous notes, became the most damning evidence of Nazi cruelty and of Jewish resistance. The Germans had won the physical battle, but they had lost something greater. They had destroyed a city, but they could not destroy the meaning of what had happened there. The fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto had done what no one expected. They had fought the most powerful army in the world with little more than courage and conviction. They had forced the Nazis to spend nearly a month crushing a rebellion that was supposed to last a day. They had died, but they had changed history. After the war, the ruins of the ghetto were bulldozed, its ashes buried under new streets and buildings. But the memory of the battle did not fade. Survivors who had escaped through the sewers told their stories. The world learned of Mordecai and Neelwick's and his fighters, of the boys and girls who had turned rubble into ramparts. The images of the burning ghetto became symbols of both tragedy and triumph, the proof that resistance had existed even in the darkest place imaginable. The battle for every street was not a conventional war. It was a war of spirit, of defiance, of memory. It showed that courage could exist without hope, that meaning could be found even in certain death. The Germans thought they were crushing rebellion. In truth, they were witnessing the rebirth of humanity in its purest form, the will to fight for dignity even when the body was broken. When the smoke finally cleared and the fires died, the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto stood as silent witnesses to the unbreakable will of those who had lived there. The battle was over, but its echoes never ended. They carried through history, across generations, a reminder that even in a world built on cruelty and control, the human spirit will always find a way to rise, to resist, and to burn bright, even in the inferno. Chapter 12. Mordecai and Neelwick's, the last commander. The story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is impossible to tell without him. Mordecai and Neelwick's, just 24 years old when he died, became more than a man. He became the embodiment of defiance, the voice of a people who refused to vanish quietly into history. In a world that had been stripped of light, he was the final spark that refused to go out. When the walls of the ghetto trembled, when flames rose into the night sky, when the cries of the dying filled the streets, he stood in the center of it all, calm, determined, unyielding. His life was short, but his legacy outlived empires. To understand the uprising, you have to understand the man who led it. He was born in 1919 in Wisco, a small town northeast of Warsaw, into a poor Jewish family. His childhood was not remarkable, at least not at first. Like so many others of his generation, he grew up surrounded by hardship, discrimination, and dreams that felt out of reach. But even as a boy, Mordecai stood apart. He was quiet but passionate, curious but stubborn. He devoured books, especially those about history and revolution. His teachers said he had a seriousness beyond his years, as though he already knew he was living in a moment that demanded something extraordinary. When his family moved to Warsaw, he joined Zionist youth groups like Hashomer Hatzair, a movement dedicated to Jewish education, self-reliance, and the dream of building a new future in Palestine. It was there, among other idealistic young people, that his leadership began to take shape. The late 1930s were years of growing darkness. As fascism spread across Europe, anti-Semitic violence increased in Poland. Mordecai, still a teenager, became deeply involved in organizing self-defense groups for Jewish youth. He believed in education, but he also believed that knowledge meant nothing without action. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, his world collapsed overnight. Warsaw fell after weeks of bombardment, and the new rulers wasted no time in turning the city's Jewish population into prisoners. Mordecai was only 20 years old, but his sense of purpose hardened. While others fled or hid, he stayed. He helped form underground schools, taught children, distributed leaflets, and tried to keep a sense of humanity alive amid the chaos. But the news tightened quickly. In November 1940, the Germans sealed the Warsaw Ghetto. The walls rose, and freedom vanished. Inside those walls, Mordecai saw what the world would not. He saw starvation used as a weapon. He saw the slow death of spirit. He saw parents trading their last possessions for a loaf of bread, children crawling through holes in the wall with stolen food, German soldiers shooting for amusement. He wrote letters to friends outside, describing the horror, but always there was an undercurrent of hope. He refused to give in to despair. Even then, he believed there had to be a way to fight back. But for a long time, no one listened. The idea of resistance seemed impossible. How could a handful of unarmed, starving Jews stand against the most powerful army on earth? Yet, as the months passed and the bodies piled higher, that question began to change. It was no longer, how can we fight, but how can we not? The Great Deportation of 1942 transformed him completely. Over 260,000 Jews were sent to Treblinka in a matter of weeks, and the truth became undeniable. Deportation meant death. Mordecai lost friends, comrades, perhaps even family, though records are unclear. He watched the trains leave day after day until the streets were silent. Then he looked at what was left, tens of thousands of hollow-eyed survivors, and he understood. The Germans had taken everything but their will to resist. It was time to turn that will into fire. He began to unite the surviving youth movements under one banner, forming the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, the Jewish Combat Organization, or OB. It was an impossible task. The youth groups had been divided by politics, religion, and ideology for years, but Mordecai had something greater than argument: conviction. He spoke to them with a calm that disarmed cynicism. "We cannot save our lives," he told them, "but we can save our honor." Those words spread through the ruins like a gospel. He became the natural leader, not because he demanded it, but because no one else could inspire that kind of faith. Under his command, the ghetto began to prepare. Weapons were smuggled in from the Polish underground: handguns, grenades, explosives. Bunkers were built, tunnels dug, and fighters trained. He was not a soldier by profession, but his intelligence and instinct made him a tactician. He understood that the Germans' greatest weapon was fear, and so he made it his mission to destroy fear before the battle began. He trained his fighters to think not as victims, but as soldiers. Each night, by candlelight, he told them that their goal was not survival, but meaning. "We will die," he said, "but not without a fight. The world must know that Jews did not go like lambs to the slaughter." When the Germans entered the ghetto in January 1943, Mordecai led his fighters in the first armed resistance. The skirmish lasted 4 days and ended in temporary victory, shocking the Nazis and inspiring the survivors. After that, there was no turning back. The ghetto became a fortress, and he became its commander. For the next 3 months, he prepared for the final battle. Every decision, every plan, every weapon passed through his hands. He was everywhere at once, organizing supplies, delivering speeches, comforting civilians, and writing letters. He was not larger than life, but precisely human, tired, hungry, often sick, but unwilling to rest. Those who met him said his eyes burned with a quiet fire, the kind that could make others believe the impossible. When the uprising began on April 19th, he was in his bunker at 18 Mila Street. Above him, chaos exploded. The Germans poured into the ghetto with tanks and flamethrowers, expecting submission. Instead, they met resistance on every street. Mordecai directed the battle through couriers, coordinating units, moving fighters from one position to another. His calm, under pressure, kept the resistance organized. He never shouted, never panicked. Even as buildings collapsed and flames spread, he spoke in a steady voice, reminding his comrades why they fought. The German assault was relentless. Every day brought new horrors, flamethrowers sweeping through basements, grenades exploding in the tunnels, entire blocks reduced to ashes. But Mordecai refused to surrender. He moved between bunkers, encouraging the fighters, visiting the wounded, comforting civilians. His presence became a kind of shield. People felt safer when he was near. "As long as he lives," one fighter said, "the ghetto still stands." His leadership was not about power. It was about belief. He reminded them that they were writing history. "Our struggle will be remembered," he told them. "Even if we all die, others will know that it was possible to fight." Those words gave meaning to the suffering. They turned fear into fury, despair into purpose. For every building the Germans destroyed, another pocket of resistance rose from the rubble. For every fighter who fell, another took their place. It was not strategy, it was spirit. In his final letter, written in late April, Mordecai's voice is calm, almost serene. "The dream of my life has come true," he wrote. "I have seen Jewish self-defense in all its glory." He described how the fighters had withstood the German assault longer than anyone believed possible, how even as the ghetto burned, the spirit of resistance burned brighter. He knew the end was near. Supplies were gone, the bunkers were collapsing, and the Germans were flooding the tunnels with gas. Yet, he wrote not of despair, but of pride. "We will die," he said, "but we will die with honor. The world will know that free men lived here." On May 8th, 1943, the Germans surrounded his bunker at 18 Mila Street. They fired tear gas inside, trapping nearly 100 fighters, including Mordecai and his closest comrades. The air filled with smoke and choking gas. Some tried to fight back, others prayed. Mordecai made his choice. He gathered his people and told them there would be no surrender. "We will not let them take us alive," he said. Then, in the silence that followed, the bunker became still. When the Germans entered later, they found only bodies. The commander was gone, his final act one of defiance. Mordecai Neilwicks died as he had lived, leading, unbroken, unafraid. He had commanded one of the most remarkable acts of resistance in modern history, not because it succeeded, but because it existed at all. His death was not the end of the uprising, but its apotheosis. The fighters who survived continued for days after his passing, inspired by his example. They fought in his name, whispering his words to one another as they loaded their last bullets. Even in death, he led them. After the war, his name became legend. Survivors who had escaped through the sewers told stories of his bravery, of his quiet authority, of the way he made others believe in themselves. Some remembered his smile, others his steady voice. All remembered his courage. His bunker, 18 Mila Street, became a sacred site. After the war, it was turned into a memorial, a mound of earth marking the place where the commander and his comrades made their last stand. Beneath it lies no single grave, but the collective resting place of heroes who refused to kneel. Mordecai never saw the liberation of Warsaw, never saw the end of the war. But in many ways, he achieved something greater. He gave the Jewish people a story of resistance to stand beside their suffering. He proved that even when stripped of everything, food, weapons, allies, hope, a human being could still choose to fight back. His life became the answer to the question that haunted the Holocaust. Why resist if death is certain? Because resistance gives death meaning. Because resistance turns victims into witnesses, and witnesses into legends. In the decades that followed, his name echoed beyond Warsaw. Streets and schools were named after him in Israel, Europe, and America. Children learned his story not as a tale of tragedy, but as a lesson in courage. His letters were studied by historians, his face immortalized in memorials. He became, in the words of one survivor, the face of Jewish defiance. Yet behind the legend was still the young man, a boy from Wisco who loved books, who dreamed of a better world, who believed that one act of courage could light the darkness. The world he dreamed of never came to pass, at least not for him. But the fire he lit in that ghetto bunker spread far beyond those walls. It burned in the hearts of resistance fighters across occupied Europe, in the spirits of those who survived, and in the memory of those who came after. The Germans thought they had extinguished the uprising when they crushed the ghetto. In truth, they had only fanned its flames. Mordecai Annihilation remains, to this day, the last commander, not because he was the final leader of the ghetto, but because he represents the final act of defiance before silence. He stands as a symbol of every nameless fighter who picked up a gun, every child who carried a message, every mother who refused to give up her child without a fight. His courage was not born of hope, but of necessity. He knew the outcome, but he chose the battle anyway. And that choice changed everything. In the end, when the fires of the ghetto died and the city lay in ruins, his spirit lingered. In the smoke, in the silence, in the scorched bricks of Mila Street, there remained the faint echo of his voice, a reminder that even when a people are pushed to the edge of extinction, they can still find within themselves a power that defies the logic of survival. It was not victory in the military sense, but it was victory of the human spirit, and that, perhaps, was the victory he had always wanted. Mordecai Annihilation did not live to see freedom, but because of him, freedom survived in memory. His fight, his words, his death became the unspoken promise of every act of resistance that followed, from the forests of Poland to the streets of post-war Israel. In the ashes of the Warsaw Ghetto, one man's defiance became the story of an entire people's rebirth. The last commander fell in darkness, but his light has never gone out. Chapter 13. The Destruction of the Ghetto. Warsaw is no more. When the fires finally began to dim in early May of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto was no longer a city. It was a shadow, a skeleton of blackened bricks, scorched streets, and buried lives. The uprising had lasted longer than anyone had believed possible, nearly a month of defiance against the most brutal army on earth. But the Germans had returned with a vengeance, determined to erase not only the fighters, but the very memory of their existence. What followed was not a battle anymore, but an extermination of stone, of history, of everything that once breathed. It was the deliberate erasure of a world. And the man behind that destruction was SS General Jürgen Stroop, a man who would turn methodical murder into military procedure. When Stroop took command in mid-April, he arrived with a clear order from Himmler himself. The Jewish quarter of Warsaw is to be destroyed and razed to the ground. He saw the ghetto not as a battlefield, but as a problem to be solved. The resistance had humiliated the German army, and Stroop's ego demanded revenge. He promised that in a few days, there would be nothing left but rubble. He gathered his officers and laid out the plan. Every house was to be burned, every bunker blown up, every survivor killed or captured. The ghetto would cease to exist, and the world would forget it had ever stood. The Germans began their operation with a precision that only bureaucratic cruelty can achieve. Soldiers marched in tight formations down streets already choked with debris, their boots crunching over glass and ash. They carried flamethrowers, grenades, and explosives. Their faces were smeared with soot and exhaustion, but their orders were clear. If it breathes, burn it. If it moves, shoot it. If it hides, bury it. The resistance had grown silent. Many fighters were dead, others trapped underground, but the Germans did not care. Silence did not mean victory. It meant they had to dig deeper. They started systematically. Each day was assigned a target block. Buildings were searched, looted, and then set ablaze. The flames spread quickly through the wooden structures, leaping from roof to roof, until entire streets became rivers of fire. Smoke filled the sky, turning day into night. The smell was unbearable, a mix of burning brick, clothing, and human flesh. Even the German soldiers covered their faces with rags to keep from gagging. Yet still they worked, methodically, almost robotically, as if erasing an entire community were just another task in a day's schedule. Beneath the ruins, life still clung stubbornly to existence. In bunkers and basements, thousands of men, women, and children hid in the darkness. They listened to the explosions above, to the crackle of fire, to the distant cries of those caught in the open. The walls trembled around them, dust falling from the ceiling with every detonation. The air grew thick, foul, impossible to breathe. The flames ate the oxygen. Some suffocated quietly, others clawed at the walls, desperate for air. Many chose to end their lives before the Germans could reach them. Mothers smothered crying infants so their sounds wouldn't betray the hiding place. Fathers sat motionless, their hands trembling over grenades they would use when the door burst open. The bunkers that had once been symbols of defiance became tombs. Above ground, Stroop's men continued their march of destruction. They looted valuables from the dead and dying. Rings torn from fingers, watches ripped from wrists, gold teeth pried from mouths. SS photographers followed them, documenting the operation with chilling detachment. The images would later fill the pages of Stroop's report, titled with grotesque pride, "The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw is no more." In one photograph, German soldiers lead a terrified child out of a burning building, his hands raised in surrender. Behind him, flames devour the last remnants of his world. The photo became one of the most infamous images of the Holocaust, an unintentional monument to the horror that Stroop had tried to hide beneath military terminology. Each explosion sent waves of dust through the city, settling over the ruins like a gray snow. The noise never stopped. Day and night blurred into one continuous roar of destruction. German loudspeakers blared promises of mercy to anyone who surrendered, but those who emerged were often shot or sent to the labor camps at Poniatowa or Troniki. Few believed the lies. They had already seen too much. The Germans dragged prisoners into the open, forced them to dig trenches, then shot them and used their bodies as part of the barricades. Even for seasoned soldiers, the ghetto had become a vision of hell. In his daily reports to Himmler, Stroop wrote with bureaucratic pride, "Today, 13,000 Jews were eliminated." He recorded on one occasion, "We destroyed 140 buildings." He wrote as though cataloging repairs, not atrocities. His words carried no emotion, no acknowledgement of the lives erased. Each line reduced human beings to numbers, to logistics. Yet between those lines, the truth screamed. The Germans were fighting not an army, but an idea. Every act of destruction was a desperate attempt to annihilate the memory of resistance. And still, even in those final weeks, defiance flickered like the last ember in a dying fire. Small groups of fighters continued to emerge from the sewers at night, launching surprise attacks on German patrols before retreating back underground. They had no hope of victory, but every bullet, every explosion was a declaration that the spirit of the ghetto refused to die. The Germans, infuriated, began flooding the sewers with gas and water. Entire groups of survivors drowned or suffocated beneath the streets. The smell of death seeped up from the drains. The soldiers could hear screams echoing in the tunnels below. Stroop noted it with cold satisfaction. "We have liquidated another rat nest," he wrote. By early May, only a handful of fighters remained. On May 8th, Stroop's troops surrounded the bunker at 18 Mila Street, the headquarters of the Jewish Combat Organization. Inside, Mordecai Anielewicz and his comrades were trapped. When the Germans fired gas into the entrance, the bunker filled with smoke. Those inside refused to surrender. They took their own lives, as they had vowed to do. Stroop recorded it as a military success, never understanding that their deaths were the very definition of victory, the final act of defiance that his entire army could not erase. The destruction continued for another week. On May 16th, Stroop decided to mark the end of the operation with a spectacle. The Great Synagogue of Warsaw, one of the city's proudest landmarks, still stood at the edge of the ghetto. He ordered explosives placed around its base. As his officers watched from a distance, the massive building erupted in a column of fire and dust. The walls collapsed inward, the dome fell, and a cloud of ash rose into the sky. Stroop turned to his men and said, "The Jewish quarter of Warsaw no longer exists." In his mind, it was a triumph, a gift to his Führer. In truth, it was the most profound admission of failure. For even as he reduced the ghetto to ashes, the very act of destruction ensured that its story would never be forgotten. After the final explosion, there was nothing left to burn. The ghetto had become a wasteland of ruins, a landscape so unrecognizable that even locals who had lived there all their lives could not find their own streets. The air was still thick with smoke, and the ground was littered with twisted metal, charred bones, and the melted remains of what had once been home. German soldiers scavenged through the debris for loot, tossing aside bodies like debris. Stroop toured the ruins with his photographers, posing for pictures amid the wreckage, as if visiting a construction site. He smiled in those photographs, self-satisfied, proud. He had no idea that those same images would one day hang in a courtroom as evidence of his crimes. The Germans left the ruins behind, but they did not bury them. They left them open, exposed, a warning to others. "This is what happens to those who defy us," they said. Yet the ruins spoke a different message. To those who came after, they whispered of courage, of defiance, of a people who had faced the end with dignity. The silence of the dead was louder than the boasts of the conquerors. Outside the ghetto, Warsaw continued its slow, tortured existence under occupation. Poles could smell the ashes, see the smoke that hung over the city for weeks. Many had watched helplessly as the ghetto burned, unable to intervene. Some tried to help, smuggling food or sheltering escapees. Others turned away, paralyzed by fear. But when the fires died, the absence was impossible to ignore. A part of the city itself had been erased. Where once there had been life, markets, synagogues, laughter, there was now only emptiness. The heart of Warsaw had been ripped out, and the scar would never heal. After the war, the photographs and documents from Stroop's report were recovered. They became some of the most damning evidence of the Nuremberg trials. In those black and white images, his triumph turned to testimony. Historians would study his meticulous notes, how he described the killing of thousands as cleansing actions, how he boasted of the number of bunkers destroyed. His language, cold and precise, revealed the monstrous efficiency of a regime that had reduced genocide to paperwork. The report he had written to glorify himself became his confession. Stroop was captured by the Allies, tried for war crimes, and executed in Warsaw in 1951, the same city whose heart he had tried to destroy. But even as justice was served, the ruins of the ghetto remained. They lay buried beneath rubble for years, silent witnesses to what had happened. In 1948, Polish workers uncovered one of the bunkers at Mila Street. Inside, they found fragments of the fighters' last possessions: letters, photographs, pistols, a few rusted grenades. Among them was a note written in a shaky hand. "We knew we would not survive, but our courage will survive us." That note, smeared with dirt and blood, said more than any history book ever could. The destruction of the ghetto was meant to erase memory, but it achieved the opposite. The story of the uprising spread across the world, carried by survivors who had escaped through the sewers and hidden in the Polish countryside. They told of the flames, the battles, the songs sung in the bunkers. They told of Anilwix and his fighters, of their bravery, of their final stand. The world, which had once been silent, began to listen, and in that listening, the ghetto lived again. What Stroop saw as the end was really the beginning of remembrance. From the ashes of Warsaw rose a warning that would echo for generations. That silence in the face of evil is complicity, that even the smallest act of defiance can matter, that courage is not measured by victory, but by the refusal to surrender. The ghetto was gone, but its spirit was not. Today, where the walls once stood, monuments rise instead, stones carved with the names of the dead, paths that trace the outlines of vanished streets. The air is quiet there now, but if you stand long enough, you can almost hear it: the crackle of fire, the shouts of fighters, the echo of resistance. The ghetto was destroyed, yes, but it was never defeated. Stroop's words, "Warsaw is no more," were a lie. Because as long as the story is told, as long as those who perished are remembered, Warsaw still lives. And so the ghetto that was burned to nothing became immortal, not in its walls or its streets, but in its defiance. The destruction that was meant to erase it instead carved it into the memory of humanity forever. And when history speaks of courage born in despair, it will always whisper the same name: Warsaw. Chapter 14. The Aftermath, Scattered Flames of Resistance. When the last explosions faded and the final fires sank into smoldering ruin, the Warsaw Ghetto was dead. The uprising had been crushed with a brutality that defied comprehension. And yet what the Germans failed to understand was that the uprising's power did not end with its destruction. It spread, like embers carried by the wind, across Poland, across Europe, across time itself. In its ashes, the scattered survivors became messengers. The story of what had happened behind those walls would outlive every soldier, every general, every regime that tried to silence it. The ghetto had been reduced to dust, but its defiance became something immortal. In the days immediately after the destruction, the city was a wasteland. The ruins of the Jewish quarter stretched for miles, blackened, broken, silent. The air still smelled of smoke and ash. Here and there, faint wisps of flame flickered from the collapsed buildings, feeding on the debris of what had once been homes, schools, and synagogues. German patrols still moved through the rubble, shooting anyone who stirred. Yet, hidden beneath their boots, in the sewers and the tunnels, life persisted. A few hundred people had survived: fighters, civilians, children. They crept through the darkness like ghosts, guided by memory and instinct. Every step through the tunnels was a step between life and death. Some of them emerged in the Polish parts of Warsaw, weak and covered in filth. Many were caught by German patrols and executed on the spot. Others were taken in by Polish families who risked their own lives to hide them. A handful made contact with the Polish underground, the army of Krajowa, and joined the resistance. They brought with them stories of what had happened inside the ghetto, of the battles, the flames, the bravery. Their words spread in whispers at first, then in underground newspapers, carried through occupied Europe by couriers and partisans. For the first time, the world beyond the ghetto walls began to understand that the Jews of Warsaw had not gone quietly. They had fought. Among those who escaped through the sewers was Zivia Lebetkin, one of the leaders of the Jewish Combat Organization. When she emerged, she was half conscious, Her lungs burned from the gas the Germans had pumped into the tunnels. She found herself standing in a world that no longer recognized her. The city she had lived in was gone. Her comrades were dead. Yet even as she stood among the ruins, she made herself a promise to keep the memory of the uprising alive. She would become one of its witnesses, its chroniclers, and later, one of the founders of Kibbutz Lohemei Ghetto in Israel, a community built by survivors to preserve the story of the resistance. For Zivia, survival was not an act of luck. It was an act of responsibility. Other survivors, too, carry the story forward. Yitzhak Zuckerman, known by his code name Antek, escaped to the Aryan side of Warsaw after the final battles. He continued to work with the underground, coordinating with Polish partisans and documenting everything that had happened in the ghetto. When the war ended, it was Zuckerman who would stand before judges and historians, recounting every detail of the uprising so that no one could ever deny it. "I was not one of those who survived because I wanted to live," he said later. "I survived because I wanted to tell." That was the essence of the aftermath, the transformation of resistance from battle to memory. Even as Warsaw lay in ruins, the flames of rebellion spread. In other ghettos across Poland and Eastern Europe, the news of the Warsaw Uprising inspired acts of defiance. In Białystok, Vilna, and Krakow, Jewish fighters took up arms, knowing they faced certain death. In the extermination camps themselves, where survival seemed unimaginable, revolts erupted. In August 1943, prisoners in Treblinka attacked their guards, seized weapons, and set fire to the camp. Many were killed, but several escaped into the forests. A few weeks later, a similar uprising broke out in Sobibor, led by Jewish prisoners who had heard whispers of Warsaw's defiance. They too fought, and though most died, the camp was forced to shut down. The echo of Warsaw had reached even the heart of the killing centers. But within Warsaw itself, the aftermath was not liberation, it was silence. For those who had lived through the flames, life became a long act of wandering through emptiness. The Germans bulldozed the ruins of the ghetto, flattening the rubble into the earth. They sent teams of forced laborers to salvage bricks and metals, erasing the physical evidence of what had happened. The streets disappeared, the names vanished, and where once there had been a city within a city, there was now only a flat expanse of dirt and ash. The Germans planted grass over the ruins, a grotesque attempt to bury history beneath green silence. But the ground still whispered. It still held the bones of the fighters, the traces of their bunkers, the fragments of their letters. It still remembered. Outside Poland, the world's attention was divided. The war was still raging, and the Allied governments, though they heard rumors of uprisings and extermination, were slow to react. The full scale of the Holocaust remained incomprehensible to most. The Jewish resistance, however, had already shifted its focus. In the forests, Jewish partisans fought alongside the Soviets, ambushing German convoys and destroying supply lines. Some were survivors of the ghetto. Others had escaped earlier deportations. They fought not as victims, but as soldiers. They carried with them the same conviction that had driven Mordecai and Neelwicks to fight, even in hopelessness, was to reclaim humanity. When the Red Army entered Warsaw in January 1945, they found a city of ghosts. The ghetto was gone. Out of the 500,000 Jews who had once lived there, only a few hundred remained in the city. The ruins of the Jewish district were a scarred wasteland, frozen beneath the snow. Soviet soldiers walked through the rubble in silence, unable to imagine that this place had once been filled with laughter and life. They found fragments of burned books, rusted weapons, and bones scattered like gravel. The air still smelled faintly of ash, even 2 years after the uprising. But even as the physical ghetto vanished, its spirit refused to die. Survivors who had escaped spread across the world, some to Israel, some to the United States, others to displaced persons camps in Europe. They carried the story with them, often written on scraps of paper or told in whispers to those who would listen. In 1946, The first accounts of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began to appear in print, written by those who had fought there. The names of the fallen, Annihilation, Edelman, Lebetkin, Zuckerman, became symbols of defiance. For the Jewish people, the uprising was not only a story of death, but of life reclaimed through struggle. In the following years, historians, poets, and survivors wrestled with its meaning. Was it a tragedy? A triumph? Both. For some, it was a wound too raw to touch. For others, it was proof that even in the heart of darkness, there had been light. Marek Edelman, one of the few surviving commanders of the OB, refused to be called a hero. He insisted that they had not fought for glory, but simply because there was no other choice. It was not a fight for life, he said. It was a fight for the right to die with dignity. His words cut through the rhetoric, reminding the world that heroism is not born from victory, but from the refusal to surrender to despair. In 1948, workers rebuilding Warsaw uncovered a buried archive beneath the rubble of the former ghetto. Inside rusted milk cans and metal boxes were thousands of documents, letters, diaries, photographs, official records. They had been buried by a group of Jewish historians led by Emanuel Ringelblum, who had vowed to preserve the truth of the ghetto for future generations. The discovery of the Ringelblum archive was like hearing voices from the grave. In those pages were the testimonies of ordinary people, teachers, mothers, children, who had written down their lives as the walls closed in. Their words transformed the understanding of the Holocaust. They made the dead speak again. For Poland, the memory of the ghetto became both a burden and a legacy. After the war, when the country lay under Soviet influence, the story of the uprising was reshaped to fit the new ideology. The Jewish fighters were celebrated as anti-fascist heroes, but their Jewish identity was often downplayed. It took decades before the full truth, the distinctly Jewish nature of their resistance, was openly acknowledged. Yet even under censorship, the legend survived. The streets that had been destroyed were rebuilt, and where the walls of the ghetto once stood, memorials began to rise. The first was small, a plaque placed by survivors who returned to pay tribute to their comrades. Later came larger monuments, stones engraved with the names of fighters, sculptures depicting the burning city. But perhaps the most powerful monument of all was not built of stone. It was the simple mound at 18 Mila Street, where Mordecai Anilwix and his fighters had made their last stand. Beneath it lay the remains of the command bunker, filled with earth from Israel and Poland, mixed together as a symbol of unity. At the top of the mound, an inscription reads, "This place is the grave of the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto. They fought and died so that they might live in human memory." Every year, on the anniversary of the uprising, people gather there in silence, laying flowers and candles. The wind that moves through the trees carries the faint echo of that long-ago battle. The whisper of gunfire, the crackle of fire, the heartbeat of defiance that refuses to die. The aftermath of the uprising was not a single moment, but a continuum, a struggle to preserve truth in a world that wanted to move on. As the years passed, survivors aged, their voices fading. But new generations took up the task. Writers, filmmakers, and historians dedicated their lives to retelling the story, ensuring that the ghetto's flame never went out. Museums were built. Films were made. School children across the world learned the name of Warsaw as both a place of death and of unbreakable courage. The uprising became more than history. It became a lesson written in blood and fire. The scattered flames of resistance burned quietly, but they never went out. They lived in every act of remembrance, every story told, every monument raised. They lived in the faces of the few who survived and the millions who did not. The ghetto had been destroyed, but its people had given the world a final gift. The reminder that even when humanity stands on the brink of extinction, the human spirit can still choose to rise, to fight, to speak. And so, as the ruins of the ghetto gave way to new streets and buildings, its presence never truly vanished. Beneath the modern city, the ghosts still walked. The children who smuggled bread, The mothers who whispered lullabies beneath the sound of gunfire. The young men and women who picked up pistols and faced tanks with nothing but courage. They remained there, in the soil, in the wind, in the silence that falls over the city at dusk. Warsaw rebuilt itself, but beneath the concrete lies the heartbeat of a vanished world that refused to be forgotten. The uprising's ashes became the foundation of a moral truth that still burns. Oppression can destroy bodies, but not belief. Tyranny can silence voices, but not memory. The Nazis declare that Warsaw was no more, but in the hearts of those who survived, it still lived. It lives today, in every candle lit on April 19th, in every story told by a teacher to a student, in every breath drawn in defiance of cruelty. The ghetto's flames were scattered, but they became stars. And those stars still burn in the night sky of history, reminding us that even when the world collapses, courage can outlast destruction, and memory can outshine death. Chapter 15. Memory and Reckoning. The Echoes of Warsaw. When the guns finally fell silent, and the last German forces retreated from Poland, the ruins of Warsaw stood as more than a graveyard. They were a wound carved into the heart of humanity. It was 1945, and the world staggered out of the ashes of the Second World War. Cities could be rebuilt, nations could be restored, but what had been lost within the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto could never be recovered. It was not merely a place that had been destroyed. It was an entire civilization, a culture that had thrived for centuries, erased in less than 6 years. And yet, even in absence, the ghetto remained alive, in memory, in testimony, in the relentless need to bear witness. The uprising had ended, but its echoes would shape how the world understood both evil and resistance for generations to come. When the Red Army entered Warsaw in January 1945, they found a city almost uninhabited. Snow covered the ruins like a burial shroud, and beneath it lay the remnants of the ghetto, collapsed tunnels, burned bricks, scattered bones. Soldiers wandered through the rubble in silence, unsure if they were walking through a battlefield or a cemetery. Here and there, they found fragments of life, a child's shoe, a melted menorah, a diary half consumed by fire. There were no streets anymore, no landmarks. Even the names of places had been swallowed by destruction. The wind moved through the ruins, carrying the faint, hollow sound of what once had been life. Warsaw, once called the Paris of the East, was now a skeletal monument to both human cruelty and human courage. The few who returned to the city found it impossible to recognize. Survivors came back to search for family, but the city gave them no answers. The addresses they remembered no longer existed. The places where they had grown up were nothing but mounds of ash. Many wandered through the ruins for hours, calling out names that no one answered. For them, survival was not relief, it was exile. They had outlived the world that had given them meaning. Yet even in the face of this emptiness, some began the impossible task of remembrance. They collected artifacts, buried documents, fragments of letters, anything that might prove that once, here, people had lived, dreamed, and fought. Because they understood something vital. Memory itself had become a form of resistance. One of the first to return to the ruins was Emanuel Ringelblum's colleague, who searched for the buried archives of the ghetto. Ringelblum, the historian who had organized the secret documentation project known as Oneg Shabbat, had been murdered in 1944. But his vision had survived. Beneath the rubble of a destroyed school on Noah Lipke Street, workers uncovered milk cans and metal boxes containing over 35,000 pages of documents. The writings of the ghetto's inhabitants, diaries, ration cards, drawings, photographs, essays, and witness accounts of the deportations and the uprising. It was the voice of a people who had refused to let history be written by their killers. When historians opened the first box, they found a note written in trembling handwriting. "We are writing for the future. We will not live to see it, but someone must." In that moment, the ruins spoke again. The discovery of the Ringelblum archives changed everything. It transformed the Warsaw Ghetto from a story of annihilation into a story of testimony. The world now had proof that the Jews of Warsaw had documented their suffering, their resistance, and their humanity. In a time when the Germans had sought to erase all evidence of their crimes, this archive became an act of defiance beyond death. It reminded humanity that even under the shadow of extermination, knowledge and truth could survive. For survivors, it was not enough to live. They had to remember. And for historians, remembrance became a duty as sacred as survival itself. But memory is not a simple thing. In the first years after the war, the world wanted to move forward, to rebuild, to forget. The devastation was so immense that many could not bear to look back. For Poland, now under Soviet control, the official narrative focused on anti-fascist resistance. But the uniquely Jewish nature of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was often erased from public memory. The fighters were praised as heroes, but their faith, their identity, and their tragedy were silenced by politics. Monuments were built, but they spoke in the language of ideology, not of loss. The faces of Anilwix and his comrades were turned into symbols of collective struggle, stripped of the personal pain that had defined them. Yet beneath that silence, the truth continued to live, in the hearts of survivors, in their testimonies, in their unending grief. For those who had lived through the uprising, every breath after the war carried the weight of ghosts. Marek Edelman, one of the last surviving commanders of the OB, became a doctor in post-war Poland. He rarely spoke of the ghetto for years, but when he did, his words cut deeper than any monument. "We fought not to win," he said, "but to choose the way we would die." He refused to romanticize the uprising. He wanted the world to understand the horror, the hunger, the despair, but also the quiet moments of dignity, the laughter in the bunkers, the small acts of kindness that had survived amid the madness. To him, memory was not about heroism. It was about truth. Other survivors carried that same burden into exile. Zivia Lebetkin and Yitzhak Zuckerman settled in Israel and dedicated their lives to keeping the memory of the uprising alive. They helped establish Kibbutz Lohemi HaGhetto, the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz, a living memorial built by those who had fought in the ghettos and camps. There, survivors raised children, planted fields, and built a museum to tell their story. Every year, they gathered to read the names of the dead, to light candles for those who had fallen. They refused to let the ghetto's story fade into abstraction. To them, it was not history. It was blood and breath, something that still pulsed beneath the surface of the living world. Meanwhile, the ruins of the ghetto in Warsaw began to transform once again. In 1948, the first major memorial was unveiled, a stark stone monument standing amid the rubble, designed by sculptor Natan Rappaport. It depicted muscular, defiant figures, led by Mordecai Anilwix holding a grenade in his hand. At the time, the monument's raw realism shocked viewers. It did not show victims. It showed fighters. It was a statement. The Jews of Warsaw had not gone to their deaths passively. They had chosen to resist. Behind that monument, however, still lay the rubble of the real ghetto, the charred bones of those who never had the chance to fight. And beneath it all, the silence of millions who could no longer speak. For decades after the war, the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising traveled across the world, told in books, films, and classrooms. It became a central symbol of Jewish resistance and human dignity. But it also became a mirror, forcing humanity to confront its failures, the silence of the Allies who knew about the exterminations and did nothing, the indifference of neighbors, the collaboration of those who profited from genocide. The uprising was no longer just a story about Jews and Nazis. It was a story about all of us, about what it means to stand against evil, and what happens when we don't. In the 1960s, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem revived global awareness of the Holocaust. Survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto testified, their voices steady, their words like daggers. They described the hunger, the fear, the moments of impossible courage. The world listened, many for the first time, and began to understand that what had happened in Warsaw was not just a tragedy, it was a warning. Memory became justice. Their testimonies, preserved in court transcripts, documentaries, and museums, turned into the foundation of moral reckoning. The echoes of the ghetto reached far beyond Poland, shaping the conscience of nations and generations. As the 20th century moved forward, Warsaw rebuilt itself. The streets that had once been sealed behind ghetto walls became ordinary neighborhoods again. Children played where soldiers once marched. Cafes and apartments replaced the ruins. Yet beneath every foundation, beneath every street, lay the bones of the past. The city lived with ghosts it could not see, but could never fully escape. Each year, on April 19th, the anniversary of the uprising, Warsaw paused. Sirens wailed across the city. People stopped in silence. Flowers were laid at the monuments. Candles flickered in windows. And for a moment, time stood still. It was not just a day of remembrance. It was a conversation between the living and the dead. Today, the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lives on not only in Poland or Israel, but in every corner of the world where people confront oppression and tyranny. Its meaning has grown beyond its own time and place. It speaks to the universal truth that even in the face of annihilation, the human spirit can choose defiance. When people rise against impossible odds, when they refuse to be defined by their suffering, when they fight not for victory, but for dignity, they carry forward the same flame that once burned in the ghetto's narrow streets. The spirit of Warsaw has become a symbol for every struggle against injustice. And yet, remembrance is fragile. As time passes, survivors fade, and history risks turning into myth. The danger is not forgetting. The danger is simplifying. The uprising was not a single act of heroism. It was thousands of moments of fear, hunger, courage, and choice. It was a story of people, ordinary men and women, who refused to let despair define them. Each of their names mattered. Each breath they took under the weight of terror mattered. True remembrance is not about statues or ceremonies. It is about seeing their faces as human, not as symbols. Because the moment we turn them into symbols alone, we lose what made them extraordinary, that they were just like us. The reckoning with Warsaw's memory continues. New generations of historians and artists return to the ghetto's story, not to glorify it, but to understand it. The archives are still being studied. New documents are still being uncovered from basements and attics, revealing details that deepen the narrative rather than complete it. Each discovery reminds us that history is not fixed. It breathes, it changes, it continues to demand something from us. The story of the ghetto is not finished. It lives in every act of remembrance, every lesson learned, every injustice challenged in its name. When visitors walk through the modern Warsaw Ghetto Museum, they see photographs of those who fought and those who perished. They hear the recordings of survivors, their voices trembling but unbroken. They see the walls rebuilt in glass and light, transparent like memory, fragile yet unshatterable. Standing there, one can almost feel the pulse of the past, the heartbeat of those who refuse to vanish. The museum does not ask for pity. It asks for understanding, for reflection. Because the uprising was never just a cry of despair. It was a declaration that even when the world collapses, human beings can still choose to stand. And so, the echoes of Warsaw continue to travel through time. They live in classrooms, in films, in quiet prayers whispered at memorials. They live in the conscience of a world still grappling with the same questions the fighters asked themselves. What does it mean to be human when humanity is stripped away? How do we resist when resistance seems hopeless? What do we owe the dead, and what do we owe the living? The answers are never simple, but they begin with remembrance. At Mila 18, where Mordecai and Neelwix and his comrades made their final stand, a stone monument rises above the earth. Visitors come from all over the world to stand in silence before it. Some weep, some simply close their eyes. The wind moves softly across the grass, whispering through the trees. Beneath the ground lie the remains of those who fought not for freedom, but for meaning. Above them, the city hums with life, a city reborn from its own ashes. The contrast is almost unbearable, yet it is also beautiful. For here, life and death coexist, memory and renewal embrace. The Warsaw Ghetto no longer exists on any map, but it exists everywhere that courage endures. It exists wherever people refuse to be broken, wherever oppression meets defiance, wherever memory becomes action. The uprising did not end with fire. It began something eternal. It taught the world that dignity is stronger than fear, that remembrance is stronger than erasure, and that even in the darkest corner of history, light can survive. The echoes of Warsaw are not whispers of the past. They are calls to the living. They remind us that history is not a distant story. It is a mirror. It asks us who we would be if we were there, whether we would hide, fight, speak, or remain silent. And it reminds us that silence, too, is a choice. The people of the Warsaw Ghetto chose differently. They chose to speak, not with words, but with action, with courage. And because of that choice, their voices still reach us today, carried across time like the faint but enduring sound of a city that refused to die. In the end, the Warsaw Ghetto is not only a memory of horror, it is a testament to the persistence of humanity. Its streets are gone, its people are gone, but its spirit lives in every act of resistance, in every struggle for justice, in every moment where one person stands against impossible odds and says no. The ruins are silent now, but their silence speaks louder than any monument. It says, "We were here. We fought. We endured. And as long as the world remembers, we will never be gone."